That was very Davina McCall, can I just say?
Chair, are we allowed to have teddy bears listening in on this meeting? Is he sitting comfortably?
I did wonder, Jenny, whether you'd have Christmas jumpers in your committee.
I did think about putting the Santa earrings on, Simon, but
I'm trying to work out whether Jackie's is a Christmas jumper or whether it is. It looks like it's a Christmas jumper, Jackie.
Well done.
It's a Fair Isle traditional, but sort of Christmassy theme, yes.
Well spotted.
Good evening, Jay. Can you hear us? Yeah, super. Thanks. Ali, are we aware that any councillors are struggling to log on?
No, we haven't had any calls or any emails.
Okay, then shall we start? Ali, should we wait or start?
Can we start, please?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, good evening, councillors. So I've got some information I need to read out, so bear with me whilst I just talk about virtual meetings and how we hold them. So I'm Councillor Vaux, the chair of the Community Environment and Partnerships Committee, and I would like to welcome everyone to the meeting, which is being held virtually and in accordance with the Council's rules for virtual meetings, which reflect the government regulations. The meeting is being streamed live on YouTube and will also be available to view after the meeting has finished. Councillors who sit on this committee are identified by name on the screen, and I will introduce the officers by name before they address the committee. Councillors are reminded that although this meeting is being held remotely, they are regarded as being present in a meeting of the council, and they should observe the normal rules of behaviour under the Member Code of Conduct and not allow members of their household to distract them during the course of the meeting. Can members ensure that their mobile phones are now switched off or on silent? Members of the committee will turn on their video link during the meeting and keep their microphones muted unless they have been invited to speak by myself as the chair. Members are reminded that if they switch off their video link or move away from the camera, they will be treated as leaving the meeting and will not be able to take part in any vote taken on the item under discussion. Members can indicate their wish to speak by raising their hand or by using the electronic function, and should only speak when I, as chair, invite them to do so. The officers present will only switch on their video link during the item that they are presenting, or where they wish to be invited to speak by me as chair. As chair, I will confirm the name of any visiting speaker at the appropriate time in the agenda who will address the committee by audio link. Councillors should declare that they are leaving the meeting and switch off their video link if they have a disclosable pecuniary interest or other personal interest in an item on the agenda. The councillors can switch on their video link when I call the next agenda item. Voting will be taken by a roll call, and I will confirm the recommendation proposed to the committee before the voting begins. Can each member indicate whether they are for or against the recommendation, or whether they wish to abstain? Hopefully we will not have any IT problems, but can I remind councillors that if their connection is lost, that they should immediately advise the Democratic Support Officer and use their meeting link to access the meeting again. Okay, sorry it was a long list, but we've got through it. Thank you very much for your patience. So if we start at the top, have we any apologies and substitutions? Ellie, I believe not. Is that correct?
No, everyone is here.
Thank you very much. Do we have any declarations of interest? Don't see any. Thank you. Urgent matters. I don't have any urgent matters. Nothing's come through, Ellie, that I should be aware of.
No urgent matters.
Thank you very much. If we turn to the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of November 2021, we've been informed that there is a typo on page 8, reference 25/21, bullet point 1. The word compliant is incorrect and should read complacent. Subject to that amendment, does the committee agree that the minutes are correct and can be approved? Can I have some thumbs up if everybody's happy, or nods? Yeah. Councillor Court, is that wishing to speak or agreement? Oh, I've lost Councillor Court. Oh, just agreement. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll take those as agreed. I just also wanted to note to the committee that the written responses to the community safety item were circulated to the committee earlier today. If you have any comments about those, please could you address them to Ellie afterwards. Thanks very much. If we could then move on to item 5, which is the presentation by the Basingstoke Voluntary Action. Are we going to go straight into the presentation, or did Councillor Bound wish to say anything prior to that?
Sorry, I wasn't expecting the invitation, Jenny.
I'm just asking.
No, I think it's really important, isn't it, that actually that and I know the committee's had several presentations from Basingstoke Voluntary Action over the years, and actually, blimey, this year, what a year it's been. And there's something, isn't that says actually having an umbrella organisation for our community and voluntary groups has never been more important. And I would argue in the last year that actually BVA has done some things that not many organisations would be able to do, and certainly things for us that we would probably find it more difficult to do than they have been able to do, with their close ties, connections and relationships to organisations in the voluntary and community sector. So I think it's really important that we understand and hear their view about what's going on in the sector, what's happened, what their members are telling them. And as for the rest of the agenda items, it's that for me in my portfolio, it's really important then, isn't it, that helps us inform what our relationship is like with Basingstoke Voluntary Action going forwards, how we build on everything, because that, you know, all the work that's happened in communities during the pandemic has really demonstrated, I think, to so many people that there's the importance of the community and voluntary sector, the strength of it, and actually they can do some things that not many other people can do, and they garner a lot of support that lots of other organizations wouldn't garner. So I think it's really useful for us to get that update. And you know what, I wasn't necessarily, before I was a councillor, I had a mixed relationship as a member organisation of BVA, I think it would be fair to say. And actually our relationship as a council and the capacity, the performance, the skill, the experience of Basingstoke Voluntary Action is now in such high regard, in my opinion, and I think in so many others. I think it's right that we work so much more closely with them. So I think, like the rest of the committee, I'm really interested in hearing their view about the state of the sector. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's lovely. It gave an opportunity for our visitors to get themselves online and present. So that's super. So I'd like to welcome Carol Bode, who is chair of, I don't know, is it trustees? Is that the right expression? And Daniel Neat, the deputy chief executive of the BVA. So I'll hand over to you. I don't know whether we can bring up the presentation or whether we are all looking at it separately.
No, I will now try to share my screen, so hopefully it will work. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carol.
Can you all see that now?
Yes, Carol, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I can't see you now, of course, because I'm now sharing my screen, so apologies for that. But no, thank you very much for inviting us to come and actually present this, if you like, state of the sector. It's very early results, but it's state of the sector to you. Tony Capon, my CEO, would love to have been here tonight, but I'm actually allowing him to have a night off. So he's up at the Albert Hall having a night off with his family. So for all the hours he works, that's really good. So Daniel is there too. And between he and I, we will actually now present the state of the sector, which basically, as I said, is really early results of a survey that's been done across the whole of Hampshire, including Basingstoke and Deane, which is trying to ascertain exactly where the voluntary, the community and social enterprise sector is at the moment, which I know will have a lot of information in terms of the decisions that you then take in terms of actually who you fund as such. So I've got a presentation here. What I'd like to do is go through it and then take questions at the end. And I'm going to be relying heavily on Daniel if you've got operational issues. Obviously, as the chair of trustees, I don't get involved in the day-to-day stuff, so I can give you the high-level view. But I will, between us, we will try and answer all your questions if that's all okay. So for those of you who may, and I have to put my glasses on because the slides they've given me in print here are so small, but for those of you who may not be as aware of Basingstoke Voluntary Action as others, we are the infrastructure body that serves as that strategic body across Basingstoke and Deane that tries to represent the voluntary, community and social enterprise sector. And we do this through 4 really key things that we focus on. So one is as a membership organisation, basically. So we encourage anybody who works in this particular sector to become a member of ours. We have a free membership offer. We can give them access to a wide range of development information and guidance services, etc. So that's really as a membership organisation. We're also, we try, and we're doing more of this now than we've ever done before, to try and represent the sector's views as opposed to individual views and form partnerships. So we have got a number of partnership forums, we have got a number of connections against themes. We're linked into a number of national networks, which is trying to ensure that the voice basically of the voluntary, community and social enterprise sector is represented, and we can feed that back for you. At Basingstoke Voluntary Action, we also are responsible for running the North Hampshire Volunteer Bureau, which obviously over the last 2 years has really come into its fore. and we've seen huge interest from local residents in terms of ad hoc volunteering, especially at the vaccine centres. But actually part of that is not so much getting the volunteers, but it's helping our organisations manage those volunteers and actually retain them and actually manage the motivation, their morale, etc. So it is the Volunteer Bureau. It's the if you like, the shop for volunteers for North Hampshire. And we also have, and this has come to really the fore in the last 6 to 8 months, we lead that community action. So you will all be aware of the emergency action that's come around in terms of the Afghan refugees that we're hosting in Basingstoke and others. And we are actually we are leading the coordination of support and emergency to those people. So in effect, it's the umbrella organisation for community voluntary organisations across Basingstoke. And I just really needed to tell you that so that you actually understand our place in it. We as an organisation don't necessarily deliver services, but we are the organisation that oversees those that does. So if I move on to the background to this report, there has been a state of the sector report that has been commissioned. It's being run by Action Hampshire for the whole of Hampshire, but within that there obviously is a subset for Basingstoke and Deane, and indeed our many organisations have contributed to it. So the full report is due in January 2022, so next month. So these really are the early findings that I'm sharing with you today, but they do actually try and evaluate the scale, shape and scope of what we're facing in our area. And what I'm going to run through with you is what the results are currently showing us in terms of how many people are out there trying to run organisations, be they voluntary community sector organisations. We've got an early indication of how that's made up in terms of how they're structured, the governance arrangements, their size, etc., how many people are paid and how many are volunteers. Give you an early indication of the spread across your various wards and against Basingstoke. And also there were some specific questions asked in this particular survey in terms of what has been the impact of COVID on the sector and how are people anticipating the needs going forward. So that's why the report's been put together. As I said, these are the early indications. We are still working on some of the analysis, but I'm happy to share some of the findings with you. Now, I think you may have been sent the slides. Some of them are very busy and I don't intend to go through obviously a load of the detail, but what I'm going to do is try and actually give you some of the highlights as such as I go through. And Daniel is sitting there in the background, and if I get anything wrong, Daniel, please butt in, okay? So in terms of an overview of the sector, there are actually across Basingstoke and Deane an estimated 675 organisations who are doing things, doing stuff basically across Basingstoke and Deane. And of those, 192 are registered charities. And of those, there was a 65% response rate to this particular survey, which means that actually we have a good deal of confidence in what this is telling us, because a 65% response rate to a survey is pretty good in this day and age. But what's this telling us? It's telling us that there's a workforce across Basingstoke Deane of nearly 1,400 employees and more than 5,000 volunteers, which is huge in itself. And if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, you can see there in terms of how that's spread, in terms of the areas of operation across the wards. So in general, the one with the largest line is Basingstoke wide. There are over 50 organisations in Basingstoke and Deane that are operating borough wide. Some of the others are just operating within the wards as such, and obviously we've got details of who they are. And if you look at the geographical coverage on the other side, then the big blue area is mainly local organisations. The orange are Hampshire-wide organisations operating in Basingstoke and Deane. So that would be things like, for giving an example, it would be RASAC. Now, RASAC is the Rape and Sexual Abuse Service that's offered. That is now offered Hampshire-wide, but it obviously delivers into Basingstoke. The grey area would be those national organisations, people like, we've got local offices of Mind, we've got the Red Cross, but they operate. We're seeing an increasing, if you like, startup of the, I don't know if that's yellow, is it yellow? Those yellow areas, which are international setups, non-government organisations. These are the sort of organisations that are being set up to set up schools in Africa, for instance. So we're seeing that increasing as such. And then in terms of the rest, it would be combinations of all of that. So it'd be some of the national organisations that identify with a local presence, such as the Parkinson's organisation. But just from that slide on its own, on the right-hand side, you will see that across Basingstoke and Deane, the majority are local organisations that have been set up with a view to themselves. In terms of composition, what can I tell you about this? So we looked at it, there have been questions asked about income, size by income, and I think the top left slide, when it looks at size by income, will probably demonstrate that 80% of those people operating in Basingstoke and Deane, we can actually pitch as being micro or small organisations. And what that means is they have an income of less than £10,000 to a maximum of £100,000. So they are the small people. They're the people that are ranging from people who are sort of a desk in their front room to the very small organisations. That makes up 80% of those people. When you move to the right of that scale, the super major 100 million people plus would be the example of, say, Bernardo's operating, because obviously globally, that is a global organisation that happens to have a presence with us. So that just gives you, that slide just gives you an indication of what the profile looks like across Basingstoke and Deane. So the majority are operating in that micro and small area. In terms of their target audience, the slide below, then you will see, even just by the length of the bar charts, the predominance there is with children and young people. We have a number operating in the area of family and parents. We have a number operating in older people. So that's where the majority sit. The minority actually sit in victims of crime and abuse, which is interesting. It's an interesting thing we need to explore more, because it doesn't quite tally with the increased rate of crime across Basingstoke and Deane. But that will just give you, at the moment, how they are reporting the target audience that these particular organisations are focused on. Now, I suppose a question for us all, that includes us at Basingstoke Voluntary Action and yourselves, is to what degree is there a question of how much these people are collaborating between each other and duplicating services? But you will see just from that, the span, if you like, of who the audiences are that these charities are being set up to serve as such. So that's the target audience. If I go on to the top right of the screen, the legal sector, then the majority of those operating in Basingstoke and Deane are registered charities. That's the blue box. We have a small proportion in orange operating as community interest companies. That means they're trading their services as such. We've got in the grey box a number of unincorporated organisations. Now these would be the micro neighbourhood groups that have been set up as such. And then in the orange box, there's a few others, and the others would be people that have set themselves up as foundations and trusts. And that's one of the things that we're now trying to sort of get underneath and actually understand more about the legal status. But I suppose the takeaway is that the majority there are registered charities. And you will see below that the focus of their activity, if you look at it, if you take the major lines, are on wellbeing activities, social inclusion and welfare, and education and training. They're the top three in terms of the focus of activity. The one that gets the least is actually on animal welfare. Now, how we use this information going forward, I think is going to obviously be a discussion between ourselves and yourselves and obviously those out there. But that literally is just at the moment the top line results in terms of out of all of those areas and focus of activity, which ones are actually delivering to those particular functions, if you were, as such. So quite a spread, not that dissimilar, but as I said, well-being, social inclusion, education and training seem to be the ones that are coming out on top, as it were. So that's some key, and I'm stressing these are indicative findings because there is more work to be done on all of this data. But if I move forward and look at people, we went out and we asked what was the impact on people, both either paid staff and volunteers, before COVID and during COVID and after. And so this particular slide will look at the past year, what people are reporting in terms of how the volunteer workforce changed in the past year and how the paid workforce changed in the past year. And so if I start with that top left-hand box, when it looks at the volunteer workforce, what that is telling us is that across all of those organisations that actually responded, 62% of those organisations either operate at the same level or they increased their volunteer basis, their volunteer base. So that's an interesting point, that actually, despite what's happened, volunteers actually increased. It either remained the same or it was increased for 62% of those organisations. When it turned to the paid workforce of the past year, then this went up to 85%. So 85%, which is the blue and orange, if I tell you, the blue and orange added together adds up to 85%. They stayed the same or they actually increased. Now, obviously, when it comes to paid workforce, that doesn't include those very small micro organisations for whom they have no paid staff. But for those where they do, it's actually an interesting picture, in as much as the majority stayed the same or they increased as such. We looked at, or we asked actually some questions in terms of the COVID impact on staff, and you'll see there in the middle some of the early results. I suppose the one that is showing up the most is other. Now, what does other mean? Well, the other box, when we look underneath that, is definitely showing us that basically it's mainly indicating that the impact on staff during COVID has more been about changing in hours, changing to roles, having to focus on different things, having to be more flexible, etc. So it's not necessarily, it's quite a good indication of the fact that people have been responding to the changes, they've been responding to the immediate needs, and they have also been putting in those extra hours and that extra time. And certainly from a BVA point of view, as chair of trustees, I can vouch for that in terms of the staff at BVA who have put in, I don't even want to add it up, so many extra hours in terms of actually just dealing with what's in front of us. So that's what's being reported in terms of the workforce in the past year. what's being reported on the actual COVID impact on staff. And then we asked people to take a look at what do they think was going to happen next year. And again, it's quite interesting what people are coming back with, because that top right hand box actually again is showing that it's looking as if you add the blue and the orange together, most of our organisations said they're going to be able to sustain it or increase in terms of staff, expected paid workforce changes next year. There are very few reporting that they need to decrease. And in terms of volunteers, again, there's little evidence at the moment to show that will be decreased, but quite a lot to say it'll be sustained and increased. But actually what we have seen, and we all know this over the last 2 years, is we've seen a huge increase in ad hoc volunteering. So for instance, if you take the vaccine centres, you know, at one point we had to close the books. We had so many volunteers volunteering for the vaccine centres, with over 800. I've got volunteers that will be coming forward for the request by the hospital, for instance, the Afghan refugees. So when it goes out, actually, there are a lot of people within our borough who are prepared to step up and actually volunteer. And one of the things we need to think about is how do we retain, how do we sustain, how do we keep that going forward? But it's not, it was interesting actually, because on Sunday evening, when Boris made his announcement at 8 o'clock, by 8:05, the BVA email was being flooded with local people volunteering, saying, how can I help? How can I help set up vaccine centres? And we've got to capitalise on that. So in terms of expected change in volunteers, it's not quite matching the national picture or the regional picture that faces a cliff edge, but we need to understand that more. But all I can do is tell you what we can see at the moment in terms of the evidence. So that's in terms of, if you like, spread, and that's in terms of people. When it comes to funding, again, we asked people what did they expect and what was their financial position last year. Well, forgetting last year, when we look ahead, they expect financial changes next year. 85%, that's that top box, the blue and orange added together, are expecting that they will receive the same or they will receive increased income, basically. But when we look at the current funding mix, where that income is currently coming from at the moment, and their reported expecting future funding mix, you can see there's a, you know, it's not that different, if I'm honest, and grants and what have you form the biggest part. So whilst there's some optimism out there in this particular sector, it's very much pretty much the same spectrum. There's an expectation that it will be sustained or it will improve rather than get worse. What we want to explore a bit more is, if you like, does that mean there's a lack of diversification in thinking in terms of where is the money going to come from? Is it suggesting we need to do more work in terms of actually helping people look at the realities that's facing everybody? Because you could argue there's no sense of urgency or commercial foresight coming through this, and future-proofing. So it seems to be quite a complacent picture, if I'm honest. That's my personal view that's coming through, that people know that they've received the funding through those means, but there's not necessarily at the moment any signs that people are thinking of how do we actually diversify our income, how do we future-proof our organisations. So there's more work to be done, certainly in this particular area as such. And because when we looked at the impact on funding due to COVID, again, if you add up those boxes, I think it's the blue, orange and grey in this bit, which actually there's either no effect up to increase. 57% of our organisations across the sector this year experienced the same or an increased level of funding, and 43% had a decrease. So there is more work to be done with the sector in terms of how do we diversify income? How do we actually sustain what we're already doing? We saw that 39% of those organisations who reported had to dip into reserves, 61% haven't. So we're beginning to see, if you like, the erosion of future sustainability, but as I say, more work needs to be done in this particular area to see just exactly how serious an impact that is. So that's a few facts on funding, which will come through. If I take a look at how did it impact on service delivery, then again, that top right-hand box for the past year is showing that the majority really stayed the same and increased in terms of their demand for services. Now, those services might have changed, but they are reporting there was an increase in services as opposed to a decrease. I think that bottom box is trying to show just exactly the split up at that in terms of changes in demand. So whether it was an increase, a decrease, etc., whether it's just meant increased longer waiting lists to requests for services offered. The green box of other, that is mainly, we believe, made up of those organisations which are having to totally rethink how they deliver services. So they may have been delivering them face to face, but now there's a requirement to deliver them online. So that's all being fed into the other box, which will actually we'll be able to give you more information on in the new year. And when we look next year in terms of the expected demand for services, then the majority of our sector at the moment are expecting that the demand for services will either be sustained at the current levels or indeed will increase. There aren't that many that are saying we will need to decrease what we do. The majority are saying we need to sustain at least to our current levels or increase. The final slide, the final chart on this one is the impact of COVID on delivery. And I think in a way it shows one of those charts, those norm curves really. So you've got a distribution curve there in terms of the majority face partial closure. That doesn't mean to say they stopped operating, but partial closure, where you had the top end that actually were able to grow their services, and you had the small number at the other end that were forced to close completely. And again, there will be data to actually back that up. So it's in a way, it's a standard distribution curve there in terms of the impact of COVID on our particular sector as such. I realise I'm racing through this, but we will have time for questions at the end. We basically also in this survey then obviously went out and said, well, actually, what are the needs? What are your needs, basically? And the table on the left-hand side will show just the percentages of what came back. But when we've looked at it, it basically goes into 3 areas. The 3 areas are very much around volunteering. I think, notwithstanding the fact we have seen an exponential rise in ad hoc volunteering and people wanting to give their time and respond to what effectively has been an emergency, it has forced a number of the organisations to really rethink how they may want to recruit volunteers in the future, and how they might want to retain and actually manage volunteers in the future. Because it's one thing getting volunteers, it's another thing, as we all know, about how do you maintain and how do you actually retain and maintain that morale. So the volunteering bit is certainly on the cards in terms of we need more numbers. We are going to need more numbers. BVA is getting requests virtually every day now, be it from other public sector bodies or local organisations to help with volunteers. There is a finite volunteer base, but it is high on the agenda in terms of actually how do we maintain this going forward, and how do we enable our local organisations to keep the volunteers and actually manage them in the ways they do. There's a huge cry, a huge demand then for funding, help with funding. And we certainly in BVA are increasing our services to provide support about bid writing, finding funding opportunities, and assisting with where you can go at the moment in terms of getting funding. So if you think about it, a lot of these organisations are micro organisations. They haven't necessarily got the staff, they haven't necessarily got the resources to actually go out there and source grants and source funding and write bids. So that's a huge demand within this particular sector that's been asked for. And the other one, basically, marketing and promotion. Organisations are reporting a need for assistance in actually telling people what they do. And I think this actually speaks to some of the things we know we need to address when it comes to duplication, collaboration, knowing who's doing what in the borough, because people are setting up organisations with the best of hearts and the best of interest, not knowing that there's somebody down the road or somebody in a different ward that might be doing the same. So the marketing and promotion are those three themes that are actually coming out in terms of how we need to actually respond to it. And so the next steps are very much is the full report will come out next month. It's going to be a full report which will show the Hampshire-wide findings. What we're going to do is actually show how Basingstoke and Deane actually either align with that or not. But that will be the fuller analysis when we've had a chance to really do a bit more work on what's coming through these early indications. We ourselves at BVA are reviewing actually what does that mean for us in terms of what should our focus be going forward in light of the findings. So we very much need, as that infrastructure organisation, as that member organisation, to make sure that our current support services and programmes are actually matching the need. And we're very focused on doing things where it's evidence-based need, as opposed to some of the more emotional, if you like, and emotive things that we're asked to do. So very much working on that evidential base to actually plan our programme. And the other thing is to work closely with all public sector bodies to try and bring together all of the key commissioners, stakeholders who are engaging with our sector to take forward all of that. And more of that is happening. More and more of now health are coming to us, housing is coming to us, or whatever. Is that recognition of trying to show that there needs to be far greater collaboration. So overall, if I was to say the BVA view is this is enabling us to try and keep a finger on the pulse, but it's a changing picture all the time. It's not suggesting to us at the moment we are facing an immediate cliff edge, which flies in the face a bit of what is being said nationally and regionally, but we need to do a bit more work on it. But we are concerned about those questions where there appears to be a lack of diversification, a lack of people thinking differently, future-proofing, strategic planning, which in itself could eventually lead to that cliff edge. But at the moment, I can't sit here and say that Basingstoke and Deane is facing that cliff edge that we've heard about. So Daniel, I'm going to ask you, because I've whizzed through those slides and I know you've got more of the detail. Do you want to add to any of that? And I'll stop sharing the screen.
Hi, thanks very much, Carol. That was a very interesting, lots of very useful facts there. And thank you for interpreting a lot of the pie charts, which really helped enormously, I think, to bring alive the presentation. It was really, really useful. If it's okay, because I'm mindful of time, I wondered if we might be able to tease out questions from the questions, any further detail that Daniel might be able to help with, but as part of the questions, if that's okay. Would that be all right, Carol? Super. Hi, Daniel. So, members, I'm just trying to make sure that I can see everybody again. Oh, yeah, I can now. So, have we got some questions for Daniel and Carol after that lovely presentation? Councillor Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair. Carol, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. It was, as Jenny says, very useful. And I'd also like to echo what Councillor Bound said right at the beginning about congratulations on the fantastic work you guys do. It is very much appreciated by all of us. I'm not sure if my question is for you or if it's actually for Councillor Bound or officers indeed. We're spending a lot of money on this. Our strategic funding is going to largely through you guys to very worthy organisations on the ground. No problem with that, and I'm sure they are all very worthy organisations, but we as a council have to stand by the money that we spend. So the key thing that I've not seen either in your report or in the paper that we have in front of us is how we measure the success of the money we are spending. In 2.9 in the paper, we've got the question of performance monitoring is being considered for the future the future funding strategy. But that's really what I want to understand on the grounds of, what gets measured is what gets done. I'm not sure if it's for a discussion here or if it's for a discussion at a later CEP, but that's the sort of thing that I would like to understand, because very often, KPIs are put in because they can be measured rather than they should be measured. KPI should be driving the strategy rather than just measuring it for the sake of it. If somebody could help me out on this, I'd be grateful.
So just for explanation, I think Councillor Mahaffey is referring to the next agenda item about the paper concerning the voluntary sector grant funding for next year. So just so everybody's aware.
Did you want me to get stuck into that question, Jenny?
I think it would be helpful because whilst our colleagues from the BVA are here, I think if they have, I appreciate their presentation was about the state of the sector, absolutely. But I think the fact that we have this paper about proposals that involves the BVA, I think it would be really helpful to take advantage of that.
Well, and that's why in some respects conflating the two is quite helpful, isn't it? Because it adds a sort of a better depth to the conversation and debate, I'm sure, because there's a reality, isn't it, that says we put significant funding into ensuring BVA as an organisation exists. So if we thought about funding, actually, we know if we didn't have a BVA as a borough, we'd want to create one. Just think about the numbers of organisations, 675 organisations that there are in the sector in the borough, and actually all the different themes, and we know how much the community voluntary sector work has always done to top and tail and enhance and contribute to things that need to be done for all of those themes that we see. So absolutely, we've always taken great pride in being able to give a significant amount of support to ensure certain organisations which we've currently got in let's call it the strategic label that says, you know what, you'd want to put core funding in to make sure they exist, and BVA is one of those organisations. Obviously, Simon, it also breaks down into, there are some organisations within that 675 that have some grant funding from us for programme delivery. It's always really interesting for me, and I didn't know the numbers, that actually we've got 675 organisations, but we don't actually give much money to that many organisations out of that 675, and that's really one of the key points for why we want to work with BVA going forwards, for all of the reasons that Carol articulated regarding collaboration, reducing duplication, building capacity, building sustainability, encouraging diversification as far as funding and understanding where revenue streams come from. And I suppose one of the key parts to your question is about performance. And you know what, it's really interesting, isn't it, if we think about the sort of the diverse range of organizations that we fund, because actually, do you know what, there's probably over the years, I've asked lots of questions about KPIs, and do you know what, let's be really specific about BVA. It's really interesting, isn't it, that actually we can have successful KPIs, but actually we can have a different view about performance. And Carol and I and Tony have had many a conversation about what do we really want the organisation to do, and how do we go from where we've been to where we are to where we want to be as far as how we work together. And it's really difficult to articulate that as far as KPIs. It actually comes down to the strength of the partnership, how effective the partnership is between us, and whether between us we're doing the right things to support the sector. And that's much more about the relationship, and nobody would ever want to get to the point where we were managing our relationship through contractual obligations, through KPIs for the funding that we were giving. That probably changes slightly when you get to program funding. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have. And you know what, everything that Carol says about collaboration is a key example. You know, what did COVID do? COVID funding, and some, you know, we've been able to distribute either directly or through BVA a significant amount of money to third sector organizations to either keep them afloat or to deliver services or to deliver food or to deliver medication, whatever that is. And actually it goes to that point, doesn't it, that says, are we currently funding the organizations that really need the funding? Are we giving money to organizations who are the best people to deliver the services? Or are they just the people who are just able to fill in a grant application form or even know the funding exists? We've got hundreds of organizations, literally hundreds and hundreds of organizations that we don't currently fund. And it probably would be a characterization, and I don't think it's an assassination, but a characterization of the sector that, of course, lots of things happen in the dynamics of organizations, that some of those organizations used to be one organization and they've split because people have fallen out or a new person's appeared and thought, actually, I'm filling a gap. And certainly we've had conversations during the pandemic ourselves as the local authority and also BVA that says, actually somebody said, oh, well, actually I'm going to wave my hand, I'm going to do this, I want to do that, and actually fought tooth and nail to do it when there's already somebody in existence doing that work and getting very direct funding to deliver it. And those sorts of things are really difficult to navigate through because it's full of personalities and relationships, and BVA has been really good at that. And I think one of the things that we want to do to work closer with BVA to change the program funding relationship and how it actually gets delivered, in some respects, sort of contradicts your question a bit, Simon, because I'm a strong believer of what we need to do as a local authority is do the maximum level of facilitation and support local partnerships. And probably the best leader of those partnerships is BVA, and to get that collaboration and to get those relationships working and to support organisations to deliver the best way they can and leverage the funding. And some of that's going to be about, if I thought about what is it we're trying to deliver, it's probably those things that Carol talked about with under those themes, because the things that we want a lot of those organizations to deliver aren't things that we have any responsibility for. You know, lots of, if you think about the things under children and older people, et cetera, actually, we don't have the responsibility for that as the public sector organization, but we work really closely with lots of organizations who do. So actually, some of those outputs we want delivered are actually outputs that are, I want to use the word owned, by the health service, by the care service, et cetera, et cetera. And it's those sorts of things and those sorts of relationships and that sort of focus that we need to add. So hopefully that adds a little bit of colour to what you've heard, where we're going, and really where the next paper's trying to get us to as well.
Okay, Councillor Mahaffey, would you like to follow up at all?
Not really. No, I think you said it all. Thank you very much. The one thing I would say is, in some ways, it's, you know, although I'm a big supporter of the third sector, it's kind of a shame that the third sector is there or is growing, because you know, the existence of the third sector represents a failure of our existing services. You know, we shouldn't have to rely on charities to provide, or voluntary organisations to provide a lot of these things, because it's essentially plugging a gap somewhere. But yeah, thank you for the answer.
The interesting thing, though, isn't it, Simon, that says we've always had the third sector. The third sector existed before the NHS. It's always existed whilst we've had the NHS. Yeah. And I think it's those sorts of things that says, actually, in our ecosystem in the country, it's ebbed and flowed, whether that's been about demand, supply, funding, technology, whatever it is. And I think there's a reality that says it's here, and we just have to find our best way to support it.
Yeah, no, great, Simon. Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Waldridge.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two sort of questions. The first one, it's a question to Carol about the number of organisations who've responded and the number of volunteers and things. I'm just interested to know, does that include all the volunteers that come through the churches? Because you talked about duplication, and there's a lot that sort of churches do, and like for example, the night shelter, that's mainly church led as a specific example, but there are other things that the churches do across the borough, and I'd be interested to know whether you're including them, because when you talk about duplication, I would thought that would be important to find out what they're doing as well, and collaborating with them as you know, the churches and the faith groups. So that's my first question. The second question is, I was a little bit, I suppose, I don't know if it's disturbed the right word, but I suppose worried is probably the better word, about what you said about a lot of these organisations and charities and volunteer agencies being complacent about future proofing and you know, sort of you did use the word complacent in terms of where their future funding streams are going to come from. I mean, I suppose what I'd say is a lot of them, I suppose, in my view, from my observation, is that they've just been, you know, sort of struggling or working really hard to keep going during COVID, changing their processes, adapting, being flexible. And I guess, you know, and, you know, in many cases, I would have thought sort of delivered really, really well from what I've seen anyway. So, and I suppose that it wouldn't have been the forefront of their minds to think, well, I'm not going to get the same grant I've always had for 5-10 years or whatever. So it's just a word that you used, I suppose. And I guess I get what you're saying, that the state of the economy means that they are, you know, you've got to think, where are these money, is money going to come from? But, you know, it's harder than ever, as you will know, to try and get extra funding. It's not easy to go and do fundraising events because people aren't out there to donate in the same way, to do things like marathons, things like that. You know, the local governments aren't giving money out in the same way they used to do, and you know, and people, general public, haven't got as much spare cash as they used to have. So, I mean, I'm just worried about that, and I'd like to go to your expertise or Daniel's as to what these organisations should be doing really to try and increase their funding, because that is for me worrying. So, I don't know if it's a question, but it's just a response to what you said, I suppose. So your thoughts on that would be helpful.
Thank you. No, thank you. And I think they're both very, very valid points. And I'll start and then I'll pass to Daniel, because he's probably got more detail than I have. So on your first point, in terms of does it include the churches and the volunteers, we do try and include, it's very dependent on who's actually responded, but there will be feedback from the churches, there will be feedback from that. So we try and include obviously all of the people. And I mean, at the moment, there's an operation going on in Basingstoke that, you know, our response is very much, this isn't an emergency need, it's actually down to local organisations like the churches and the volunteers to actually step up and actually help with some of this business as usual. So they are included. I don't know whether Daniel knows more about who was included, but we certainly, from BVA point of view, actually recognise and understand actually the contribution of those others. And that's the whole thing about this sector, is trying to make sure that everybody is included and everybody comes under the umbrella. Apologies, I probably used the wrong word saying complacent. I think that was probably me trying to say that I think there has been a reliance on grants. There is a reliance on funding coming. And BVA, I mean, most of our strategic discussions are all about, we can't rely on grants going forward. So what are we going to do? How are we going to diversify our income? And I think probably what I was trying to put across is that actually, if we're in that particular situation, I think that is one of the needs in terms of that came out of the future needs for the sector, in terms of understanding how even the smallest of organisations, we can make it easier for them to access monies that are available, grants that are available, the bids. Those of us that have had to sort of actually write bids and put things know that some of the bids and some of the contracts that are put out demand huge amount of information, huge amount of time that our smaller micro and small organisations just haven't got the resource to do. So we need to, that is a challenge. But Daniel, I'm going to ask you to come in. Is there anything from your point of view that you're seeing?
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone. So really just to echo what Carol has said there, and it's very much the importance now, I think the diversification of that funding. So as we progress forward, what we've really seen there in terms of the types of engagement that we've had with our groups and types of the responses that have come through there, we've seen a level of non-urgency coming forward. And I think from our part, as well as we look at the diversification of funding as we progress forward with the different types of groups we work with, I feel that that can only be of benefit to continue their sustainability. And you've seen from the report there as well, just the vast array of groups that we work with and indeed are within the borough. As Carol said, they're very much those groups as well that could just be behind the desk in the living room, for example, right to those very large organisations, each of which have a role within our borough. So I think that that's really, really important just to highlight there. And in terms of the report funding on the first point there, in terms of the data that we've collected, so we went out to all organisations that naturally we could get in touch with there across the borough. So we are always reflective on the responses that we've got. But as Carol mentioned there, we're confident with the responses we've received to date, and then the full report will be published in January for everyone.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wooldridge, are you comfortable with that reply?
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Very much. Councillor Court.
Good evening, Carol. Like the other people here, I think we've all found this a very, very good report, very useful. One of the things I'm thinking about here, in fact, is the word volunteering. Volunteers are very short in supply. I know purely from much of the work I do within the volunteering interface, how much there is a need for volunteers. And there is a concern that some of these volunteers will return to the workplace once their normal businesses revert as well. So I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts you might give on how you're going to attract new volunteers.
Oh, well, I think that there's two things when it comes to volunteers, and I mean, even before COVID, it was something that BVA were trying to think about, because the nature of volunteering is changing. So I think traditionally volunteering has tended to be, can you give up so many hours a day? Can you come and do something? And of course, today's volunteering can still be that for those that want to do it, but can also be, actually, have I got a skill or an expertise that I can actually offer somebody or something? And there is more work to be done in this, because I think in terms of volunteers, it's trying to tap into two things. One is actually, I suppose, the general social value that our people across Basingstoke and Deane have, but it's also trying to say what is and isn't possible. So, for instance, volunteering can look very different going forward. Volunteering doesn't have to be, can I give up a certain number of hours on a certain day to go and do something? But it could look as, actually, I'm an IT expert and I could actually help with somebody developing a charity's website. How can I do that? What's another one? We have a number, well, actually, when they are commuting to London, we have a number, obviously we know, in Basingstoke and Deane, who travel to London and work. they can't necessarily get back for meetings, they can't necessarily be trustees, but is there a way that we could still tap in to people's wanting to be able to volunteer, but in different ways? And there is far more work to be done on that. I think the COVID response has just shown that at a time of emergency, people step up and they will actually give their time. And I think there's a lesson for us all in that, in terms of that's a focus. It makes people focus on something. They want to do it. They want to give something back. If we can actually build on that in times when we're not in a crisis, we need to think about that. And I think volunteering, the shape of volunteering needs to change quite a lot going forward in terms of what it looks like. So you've got a number of different particular options. Again, Daniel, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
I mean, as well, just to give an example as well of one of the projects that we've been working on. So as Carol mentioned as well, we are managing site coordinating the Afghanistan evacuee programme for Basingstoke and Dean. And throughout this period of 3 months now as site coordinating, we've had 8 extremely dedicated volunteers to the programme who've been an extremely important part of the operation. And I think as I started at the very start with recruiting those volunteers from different backgrounds, different interests, right across the borough, I think for me that was most interesting, and something that I think we should really champion with volunteering, is that we can really begin to connect our communities closer together through volunteering. It's something that is an absolute part of that, because it's a shared interest, but something that comes with different backgrounds and those right across our borough. So we will continue to diversify how and the types of volunteering opportunities that not only volunteers themselves are looking for, but indeed to those organisations and their needs. And exactly as Carol mentioned there, you may have, as we know in Basingstoke and Dean, those commuting up and down to London. But again, with that remote working option now, are there other options for volunteering? Is the digital new way of working in fact really going to enhance how we indeed this evening are able to undertake our activities? So again, I think volunteering is an absolute pivotal part of our borough, and as we progress forward indeed with connecting communities further.
Thank you very much both. Councillor Court, is that all right? Can we move on?
I've got one just follow up if I might, and that
very
is
quick.
It will be very quick. How do you account in your analysis work for people who actually volunteer for 4 or 5 different companies?
Daniel, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, so in terms of the types of responses that we receive, so when we're accounting for our volunteers, we will account it for those, to my knowledge, of those who undertake the individual activity themselves. So that's how we will receive the responses for those.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Court. Councillor Compton-Burnett.
Hello, and thank you very much for that report. That was really interesting and helpful. As I'm sure you're aware, the proposed budget includes a significant cut in the grant funding for communities, for community enterprises. And I wanted to know your views on the effect that cut in grant funding would have on voluntary organisations and the services that they provide in Basingstoke.
So, if I may, Carol, yes. So, we're just going to say that, of course, whilst, of course, we would never want to see any cuts to grants budgets in an ideal world, given the understandable mounting pressure on public finances, it is important that any monies are always carefully reviewed. And the data from our state of the sector research appears to indicate that a number of groups have fortunately seen an upsurge in their funding position, which may help to temporarily buffer any short-term cuts to funding, enabling a period of time for groups to adapt and diversify their income sources. So there is never a good time, as we know, but now based on our insights, may be a better time than any other time.
Councillor Compton-Burnett, is that okay?
I'd be interested in Carol's view as well, please.
Yeah, sure. Carol.
Yeah, no, I would concur. I think it's a question of there are a lot of people out there relying on grants. but it probably does relate to the point that I made earlier in terms of we need to look at how we do things differently going forward. Some of the evidence that's coming through this particular survey is almost like flying in the face of what we're hearing nationally and regionally. And we need to understand more about why. But when you look at the evidence and you look at the number of people that feel they're going to sustain and move forward, we are definitely going to have to help many organisations understand where they can get their funding from. But we are not seeing that cliff edge. And whilst I don't want to sit here and say it's the best time to reduce grants, because it will have a devastating effect on some, but there are others that it might actually create different thinking. We need to look at how we do things differently. We need to look, it might actually even move us to greater collaboration, greater duplication of a reduction in duplication, etc. It's not going to be easy at all, but I can't, in all honesty, whilst I want to sit here and be able to say, actually, no, you shouldn't actually reduce grants, from the evidence, I can't sit here and say it's not something that needs to be considered.
Okay, thank you very much, Carol and Daniel. Okay, Councillor Coxman, yeah. Councillor Tustain.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Chair. Carol, I was just wondering, and this might be one for Daniel, of the 675 organisations on the books, how many of those actually interact with you on a regular basis? Are some of those pretty much self-sufficient? And also, do you get a lot of new inquiries? Because I think certainly since I became a councillor, BVA I became aware of BVA, and it seems to be like a sort of a well-kept secret sometimes. And I think it's also the nature of what you do is quite complex for most people to understand. So it's, how are you connecting with people in this sector? How are you connecting with people that want to do things? And going forward, or else you're looking at having a different approach, will this hopefully improve so that you become a little bit better known?
Okay, well, let me start and then I'll let Daniel come in. I mean, when I became chair of trustees of BVA, I think we had many more than we have on our books today who were just names. So part of my push has very much been, if we are the member organisation, we've truly got to become the member organisation. So I think off the top of my head, we probably, out of that 675, have got regular communication with about 200, around the 200 mark. And that is basically because we cleansed our membership database from people who we didn't have any interaction with, to those that we do. We have to, one of our targets is to become a much stronger membership organisation and actually sell what the benefits of being a member are, which are all about those 4 original things. It's about providing that volunteer bureau, providing the governance and support, providing the opportunities to come together and talk about key themes, etc. I would agree with you, it is a well-kept secret. I mean, when I became a trustee, I'd never heard of Basingstoke Voluntary Action. And I've lived in Basingstoke since 1980. So it is, there's more work to be actually done in terms of that. But I think lots of organisations actually get their reputation through success, and we need to build on that and move forward. But Daniel, do you want to say a bit more in terms of the membership body and how we're trying to strengthen our reach into those 675, of whom 200 odd we already have a connection with?
Absolutely, Carol. So one of the main pieces of work we've been doing is that naturally, as a membership body, we will have different levels of membership. So we've got our full members and associate members, we have our affiliate members, and then we have our non-members. Now we have communication from each of those particular groups. And what we're doing now is targeting our newsletters to really reflect that communication to those specific groups. One of those might be a way in which to really showcase to non-members the benefits of becoming a member, for example, the benefits of engaging with us. So part of the outreach now, and we've set up recently, we've had some pop-out stands. One of the main ones that we've been working are within the supermarkets locally. Previously, we've been working in the community buildings directly themselves, but we found that one of the main footfall places now is really outside of the supermarkets and those community areas. again, very much linked in with the community services which are there, but positioning ourselves to really promote who we are and the benefits of Basingstoke voluntary action within the community. So this is a piece of work that we are continuing to develop and really progress forward. What we're starting to do as well now is we're really redesigning and redeveloping our website. So we'll shortly have a full members section, which will be brilliant to really, again, encourage and really showcase across the borough, hopefully with further membership again. But as Carol mentioned there, we did have a number of member organisations who we didn't have that regular communication with. And I think as well, what this has really taught us is that actually for those members who are digital, it is far simpler to communicate with them. But for those who aren't, again, that's not to underrepresent those who aren't digital, it's to continue to engage with those groups to make sure that we represent every single organisation across the borough and to make sure that we communicate effectively with them. So we'll be continuing with that, and I look forward to showcasing some more of our hopeful progression with that as we progress forward into the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Testane, is that okay?
Yeah, a quick question actually. The membership package, is this something that therefore will have fees associated with it, or is it just a different classification for different groups?
Exactly that, a different classification. So we just want to ensure that the information that is going to those groups is targeted for their specific need, and hopefully then to encourage more membership from there. And this will continue as a free membership.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Councillor Ganesh.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank Carol and Daniel for the report, very detailed, and it was really useful. You've answered most of the questions I had to the previous question to Councillor Testane. Some of the graphs that you have shown saying in terms of the changes in workforce and changes in demand, there are a few organisations had some sort of an increase and some had decrease. Do you think any of those could have been sort of an offset each other, or it could have been completely left off? Is that something that you probably might be able to find out in any of the detailed comments in your full report, or is that something that may not be able to find out at all? Because we could clearly see that there are a few organisations may have acquired more volunteers because of the nature of the pandemic we've had, whereas some of the organisations may have lost them because there's no need for such a need as sort of a face-to-face and community engagement during this pandemic. So is that something you probably might be able to sort of elaborate in your full report at some point? Is that June you mentioned that you'll be expecting the full report? Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's January it's coming up, but yes, who would like to answer Councillor Ganesh's question? Carol?
I think I'll throw that to Daniel, actually.
All right, fine. Sorry, Daniel.
No problem, Carol, no problem at all. So what we will do is we will get the full report in January. So once the full report comes through, then we'll be able to really assess whether we can get through to your specific question there as well. And any further findings that we might like to take forward, we'll be able to progress from there. But ultimately as well, what we are starting to see, as Carol discussed through in those types of trends and working with those specific organisations, at the moment, again, these preliminary findings will then have those full findings within the full report in January of next month.
Yeah, thank you. Is that okay?
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much. Councillor Mamilaneni, you had your hand up, it disappeared and it's come back. Shall I come to you first?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Carol and Daniel. And my question is very straightforward and specific question. I have heard from Carol that one of the goals is to make these 675 organizations self-dependent and self-reliant. My question is, when can we expect BVA, a self-sustained entity as itself? Thank you.
Thanks. Carol?
Not sure I quite understand that, actually, Aaron, because we are a self-sustaining organisation, albeit that obviously, like any other charity, we get our funding from yourselves, but from other places, and diversify our income. So I'm not sure I quite understand your question. Out of 675 organisations, I'll go back to that. I'm not sure each one can be self-sustaining. I think that's just the number that are actually reporting that there are across Basingstoke and Deane. And the reason I say that is because a lot of them cross over, a lot of them duplicate services, and I personally believe there is quite a lot of rationalisation that we can actually do to ensure that actually whatever funding, whatever effort is put into delivering service, we can do better by collaborating as opposed to duplicating and what have you. But in terms of BVA, I thought we were self-sustaining actually at the moment, albeit that a lot of our income comes through obviously the grant that we get from the council, grant that we get from Hampshire, but also other monies that we actually are getting from some of the work we're doing. So some of you may have seen a lot of our social media recently where we've set up a basically a back office service support, which is basically a community interest company, which is a trading company. So one of the ways that we actually are trying to sustain ourselves is actually providing back office services to local charities and local voluntary organisations who haven't got the means and wherewithal to have their own finance and HR and payroll services, etc. So we're no different to any others of those that we're talking about today. But if I've misunderstood, Aaron, do tell me.
Yeah, sorry, with your permission, Chair. Sorry, what
Sure.
I mean with self-funding. Instead of really.
Yeah, so I think what are you saying, Councillor Mullany, that they wouldn't, self-sustaining would be without a grant from the council, for example? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what exactly I mean, Chair. Thank you for putting that. Yeah.
Carol or Daniel, would you like to respond to that?
I think a lot of that depends on actually what the role of BVA would be. I mean, a lot of our work actually is to provide the infrastructure and to provide that, you know, as the preferred partner, currently the preferred partner of BDBC in terms of actually your, if you like, offshoot to actually manage the volunteer and community service thing. I think actually to do that, and as we've seen, we have during the past year, we have agreed to take on services that have been devolved from the council, but we can't do that for nothing. So if you take even, I don't know, wellbeing walks, I'm just using one example that the council used to run, we've agreed to actually manage that, but actually in good commercial way, you can't suddenly take on something for nothing. So we will do it in the most economical way and we will make the most of it and we will do that. But we wouldn't be sustainable if we didn't actually negotiate appropriate contract fees as such. So can we be fully self-sustainable? We would, but whether we concentrate on delivering what the council wanted, it would be more then to what, you know, what was actually needed. We firmly believe that there is a need for that strategic body in Basingstoke. We firmly believe in the relationship we have with the council and that together we can actually deliver for you a lot of actually what's needed, a lot of that bringing together of the voluntary and community sector.
Councillor Bound, did you wish to say something, or have I misunderstood?
I just want to wholeheartedly agree with Carol. I fundamentally believe we need BVA. I fundamentally believe we need BVA to do all the things that they're better placed to do, are more approachable than a local authority would ever be to do for the third sector. There's something about the level of support that we get for the level of service that we get back and the value that it delivers. And there's also something, isn't it, that says, and I always feel the need to say this because we often focus on money on a table rather going, do you know what, you know, we offer, because we know they are a great organisation, the resource of the orchard as the building, which is not insignificant, but also grant funding. And you know what, actually, we should also always try and get best value for it. And we all know that there are huge pressures on public funding, but it's also about that stuff, isn't it, that says actually, which is why I use COVID has tested many a relationship and many a service. The place we went to first was BVA, the place where we were most comfortable to sit down and sort out what do we do about community hubs? What's the best way to distribute money to community hubs? What's the best way to make sure that we knit in all the right partners to make sure we do what needs to be done. And that was BVA.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bound. If we could move on to Councillor Poland, your question, please. I've got Councillor McKay, and then I think we should draw a line, if that's okay with everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair. I've previously been involved in the Berkshire Community Foundation, which, like BVA, does sterling work in giving money to people that hitherto nobody has heard of. £1,000 to some of these charities and organisations is obviously the lifeline. I'm just wondering whether you have any connection, not with obviously Berkshire because you're in Hampshire, but there is, as you know, a Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation, whether there's any synergy there, because they're kind of trying to do the same thing, particularly on the Berkshire strapline is local needs to meet local people, etc. And the other point I would make is that my business, whilst hitherto it used to send out Christmas cards, they were all very nice, lovely printed, etc. We came to the decision that we would actually not do that. And we would actually send out electronic cards, partly because it's greener, but also because it then gave us an opportunity to donate monies to a charitable cause which we wanted. Last year it was against breast cancer, this year it's the Hampshire and Isle of Wight air ambulance. But is there an opportunity there for Basingstoke local businesses to then actually say, I mean, frankly, I'd never heard of BVA, I'm sorry to say, but here's an opportunity for local companies to say, this is what we're going to do this year. We're going to support local businesses via, or local charities around the businesses via the BVA.
Thank you. Carol?
I think there's two things there. One is certainly across Hampshire and going over the borders, we have, there are basically 8 of these infrastructure bodies around Hampshire. And I have to say, Tony, my CEO, is the chair of a community interest partnership, which is trying to bring the 8 together so that we actually learn from each other. We also obviously are very close with NAVCA and across the borders. So from a BVA point of view, we're always up for learning from others because, we're not on our own. We don't see ourselves on our own, albeit that our focus is towards Basingstoke and Deane. But we do actually work across we try and work with our Hampshire colleagues and wider as such. In terms of actually, can we get businesses to actually sponsor BVA? That's a challenge for us in getting our name out there and getting people to understand what we do. I think when it comes to raising funds, it's a lot easier to raise funds, if you like, for a specific cause, because it's got that emotional connection with people. So if you want to raise for St Michael's Hospice, or you want to raise for the British Heart Foundation, or etc., it speaks to people's emotions. And we have still got some work to do in terms of actually, how do you get that emotional support to what is essentially an infrastructure organisation that's supporting all organisations. But that's a piece of work that we need to do in terms of our own marketing and our own advertising. But if we can get to that place, that would be absolutely fantastic. I mean, one of the things that was set up by BVA, which is starting to do that, was the Basingstoke Community Lottery. So if you think the Basingstoke Community Lottery was set up by BVA, that is now raising lots of money actually for local organisations. Probably the local organisations that are actually selling the tickets are getting the admin, but whether BVA is, I'm not sure. But actually BVA set up Basingstoke Community Lottery, and we need to do more of that to try and get that business support, absolutely. So any ideas anybody's got or any entrees would be greatly welcomed.
Thank you very much. Councillor Poland, is that okay? Yes, thank you. Councillor McKay.
I'll just help round things off by making this a comment rather than a question. I mean, firstly, thanks for the presentation. I want to express my support for what BVA does. And I just wanted members to think about something I think Carol said, which is very important, which is the challenge they face of separating the evidential from the emotion. And I think that must be extremely difficult. And I think it's important that the committee recognises that. And perhaps that encapsulates the importance of having BVA as an organisation. but does also key into the point that Councillor Mahaffey made earlier on about making sure that there is KPIs and that we measure that things are actually being delivered. So I'll just leave the committee with those thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor McKay. So I would like to draw this part of the agenda to a close with my great thanks to Daniel and Carol. It's been an extremely interesting presentation, and you've been very kind in answering a wide range of questions on all sorts of topics, which has been fantastic. And my observation, similar to Councillor McKay, would be that whilst one would hope that statutory organisations were covering all the needs for people in all sectors of our society, it has always been an inevitable truth that a lot of people are more comfortable accessing charitable and voluntary organisations than what people might see as government people who might interfere or don't understand and that kind of thing. So yes, culturally we should be able to improve that, but the reality is that I think we'll always have a need for our voluntary sector. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing the full report when it comes out, and good luck for the future. You've got some big challenges ahead, so good luck.
Thank you very much for allowing us to actually give you that, and yeah, we look forward to working with you into the next year, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you, Daniel.
Huge thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so if we move on to the next agenda item, and we might have a short break after this item if people would like comfort break. I think we'll do it after this one, if that's okay. So the next item is the community and voluntary sector grant funding for 2022-23. I can't believe these years are disappearing so quickly. So I'll just remind us what we're being asked to do here before we go to the presentations. So members are being asked on their views on the proposed one-year extension of all strategic grants that are due to end in March 2022. And this proposal is subject to agreement in principle by Cabinet in January 2022, with final decisions being made by Cabinet in March 2022, following determination of the 2022-23 budget and medium-term financial strategy, which should be at full council, as we know. And then the second item is the proposal to pilot a one-year community grant scheme to replace programme grants and to be administered, managed and monitored by the BVA. And the pilot scheme will be presented to the Cabinet in March 2022. So that's what we're being asked to give views on. So I'll ask Councillor Bound if he would like to say anything before Daniel.
Just very briefly, if I may, quite rightly, it's very straightforward, isn't it? What we're asking you to do on the paper. The only thing that I'd probably add, because I almost lost my broadband at the point that I wanted to interject earlier, because it was sort of a good segue, Chair, was actually, of course, when we look at, there was a conversation about, the well-kept secret of BVA and maximising leverage for funding from all the public sector organisations, et cetera, as far as the potential pilot of working with BVA going forwards. Of course, in that pilot, that's why we want to bake BVA in. So actually, it's much easier to work across those partnerships to turn around and say, if there's money available from a council pot through BVA, it's then much easier for us to work with, say, health partners like the CCG to say, they've got money on a certain theme as well, and maybe it's a similar process, or actually that sort of connection can be made to help organisations get more money or work together so that actually that money, whatever the size of the budget is, delivers as much as it can for all public sector organisations, because of course lots of things are in unhelpful, made up responsibilities, when actually the only thing a resident cares about is how do I get support for whatever thing I need support on is. So actually those sorts of things become really, really important to try and break down those barriers. That's really all I wanted to say, because I think it's, in some respects, the paper's very straightforward.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bound. Daniel, would you like to say anything about paper?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chair. I mean, just kind of, in terms of introduction, at the moment, we've got 3 community voluntary sector grant schemes or programs. The first one is strategic funding, which is very much focused on a small number of organizations, focused on core funding. So funding the operations, the management and the running of the organizations. We've got program grants, which are very much focused on delivering projects. So not about core funding or, paying for staff or buildings, but very much about project delivery. And the last one is councillor grants, which was launched earlier this year. Small grant pot to support the purchase of equipment or items that will support organisation with their activities, but also with income generation. At the moment, we're progressing 2 quite key pieces of work: the cultural strategy and also the community strategy. I appreciate, I think, that it's work in progress at the moment. And that's why we feel that our position is, instead of kind of introducing a completely new kind of grant funding arrangements and processes next year, we need to wait to have those strategies in place to help us basically inform and provide a strategic framework for future grant arrangement. And I think, things like the State of the Sector report, for example, is very important to help us think about, how we're going to support the community voluntary sector moving forward. So with strategic grants, because of the timescales, it was quite difficult for us to look at applying or making any significant changes. So hence the proposal to extend those grants for a further year on same levels of funding as they are at the moment. But having said that, we also want to start having those conversations about kind of sort of performance management and monitoring. We are conscious, that sort of the current KPIs we have in place have been in place for quite some time now. And I think, things have changed. Organizations have had to kind of adapt and operate differently. We want to make sure that sort of our performance monitoring is still relevant and fit for purpose and very much focused. I'll be honest, we have a tendency, when it comes to KPIs, to look at numbers and focus on kind of very much quantitative data. And I think, we need to move away from that a little bit and focus more on outcomes and how organizations are managed and run and perform and kind of how they use their facilities, which will be kind of a lot more meaningful for us as a council in terms of managing that performance of organization. With regards to program grants, the idea, I think, is to use next year to pilot a different scheme to help us then shape the kind of the review that will take place. It's based on kind of various factors. The first one is we're conscious that program grants are very specific and can be very prescriptive when it comes to applying for funding because of that really key focus on projects. We also know that, if you look at people we've funded over the years, it's always the same people coming back for funding. And I think, picking up on the point that was made earlier, I think, it doesn't really allow, maybe smaller organizations, to apply because sometimes, £1,000 or £2,000 is all they need. And at the moment, I think it doesn't allow for that. And also, I think, we need to bring together, I think, other sort of funding bodies we have locally, because as Councillor Ban mentioned, we know that the CCG has got some fund, they kind of give to local organizations. We know that housing associations have got the same. So by pulling together, I think, a panel of local funders, county council as well, and having that managed and quality by BVA, that have got sort of a sort of deeper insight, I think, in the sector, will help us make sure, I think, the funding is diversified. We are able to fund more organizations. And also for me, it's kind of that flexibility, basically having a new grant pot that is a lot more flexible and simplify the application process as well. Because we know, I think, that very often when it comes to funding, the people that receive the fundings are the ones that are good at bid writing. And I think, we've all kind of been there. And sometimes an organization that maybe hasn't got a lot of experience, bid writing can be quite daunted by, having an application form that can be quite complex. So I think, very much trying to streamline and simplify the process and very much working closely with BVA to help us with that. So I think, that's kind of all I wanted to say about the paper and kind of very much open for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That's really helpful, actually, because it sort of brings out one or two of the papers are necessarily quite black and white and two-dimensional. So I think that's really helpful to flesh it out a little. So do we have any questions or views? If we could start with any questions of fact, if it's possible, but views also very welcome. Councillor Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair. It's really just a repeat of what I said earlier, that, we talked about performance monitoring. Are we at some point going to see a definition of what success is? and is that going to come back to this committee for our review? And obviously success being something a little bit more substantial than just how much money we've given away.
Thank you, Councillor Mahaffy. I mean, that also echoes my concern, is I'm not quite sure how we're going to measure whether it's quantitative or in whatever way that, 1 point whatever million is being spent in a way that the borough is comfortable with. So I'm really interested in hearing a reply to that.
Sure. I think, as we move forward, I think, with the grants review, I think the intention is very much, to engage CEP again in that process. And I think, at part of that process, we're both looking at defining, I think, what we mean by performance management, defining kind of more closely what sort of our expectations are from organizations, what we expect in return for our money. I think, the return on investment would be quite important, moving forward in terms of what we get for our money. So I think, there'll be a lot more discussions around that, Councillor Mahaffy.
Okay, not specific, Councillor Mahaffy, but is that sufficient for the moment?
Yeah, I'd just obviously like to get it in the diary if we're going to have a definition of what success is.
Can I also add, of course, actually what we're also talking about, which is why it's really tricky, is actually, of course, some of the outcomes we want to achieve, which we're not necessarily very used to as a district council, are not necessarily short issues. They're medium to long-term achievement. If I thought about, I don't know, one of the things that we talk to our health partners about a lot, which is childhood obesity, but do you know what, it's really dangerous, isn't it? Because we can get into numbers like the number of sessions that have been delivered, but actually we're really interested in the difference that they've made. And that's something that actually is quite difficult as far as the cycle of perhaps awarding money for when you can actually evaluate and monitor the output.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Band. Councillor Disdain.
Hi, thanks, Chair. This is actually a point of clarification because I'm a little confused. In the purple chart, which is in the back of the report with the strategic grants, there's several of those grant cycles that were coming to the end anyway, and it says in the columns it's not applicable for the amount of money. So, for example, the gymnastics club, Citizens Advice have got NAs in there. Is the proposal that the funding will be extended for those ones as well, which make up the 1.3 million?
Thank you,
Absolutely. So yeah, all organizations basically whose agreement ends at the end of March 2022 will be extended for a further year. Those organizations that have got agreement in place, which I think is 2 at the moment, which is the Basingstoke Consortium and the YPI, basically their agreement will kind of carry on until kind of 2023. And then basically we'll start with a new process in 23-24.
Okay, is that all right, Councillor?
Yes, that is. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wooldridge.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was focusing particularly on the CAB, but I think you've just about answered it. So for the next year, the funding is going to stay exactly the same, not Absolutely. Go up, not go down, but it will be reviewed throughout the next year. And am I right in saying, and then the BVA will take over?
So
that's where I'm confused, and I'm sorry about that.
No, that's all right. There's 2 elements. So strategic funding, will be extended for a year, kind of on same levels of funding. So that includes CAB. In 22-23, we'll have a new sort of model basically to support local organisation. It is not intending at this stage that what we call strategic funding, will be passed on to BVA. I think it's important for the council to retain that relationship. What we want to do is basically work with BVA on the community grant side of things. So not what I would call core funding, but more kind of funding to support capacity building, resilience, volunteering effort, sometimes project delivery. But strategic funding will very much remain sort of in the, directly managed and controlled by the council.
Thank you. Sorry for that one. My second question, it links to what Councillor Mahaffy said earlier about sort of KPIs and things like this. I guess and what you said earlier about simplifying application processes, things like this for grants. Will we be giving BVA a prescriptive sort of idea of what we want them to do and on this sort of thing? Because ultimately, if the money is ours that we're giving to them, there's got to be accountability somewhere along the line. I'm not criticizing anyone or worrying about it particularly, but you know, they may be very good at the moment, but we don't know who we don't recruit for them, so we need to know that our money is being looked after, basically, is what I'm saying.
I wonder if I could explain what my experience was having sat on a previous panel for Hampshire County Council. And actually, there's a reality that and we haven't designed what the scheme would look like, but my feeling is it wouldn't look dissimilar, where actually we were very clear about the outcomes that we were looking for as far as themes, whether that was older people, children, inequalities, whatever it was. And absolutely the panel would view that. And of course, the application would include by that organisation who wanted money to say, for this money, this is what we will do, and this is how you will measure us. But actually they would then, and the panel would decide how they how they distributed money, but then there would be another conversation that said, you said in your application you would do X, Y, Z, but absolutely either there's enough there that gives us some comfort that we've got something that we can evaluate and monitor you against, or we need some more to make sure that we know what it is, and the panel will be able to articulate that along with us and BVA. So it's a very long-winded answer, to be honest, but actually it's those sorts of things that we just need to sort of, that's my view about high level how it would work. We just need to go through working out what that detail says.
And will we work out the detail before this is all?
Yeah, that's why we're asking for your thoughts about what you would like in the pilot.
Because I just think it's important that, it's taxpayers' money at the end of the day, council money, and we need to be able to account for every bit of this money, whether it be through the BVA or through ourselves or whatever, through the, how we prescribed the accountability to them.
And the other thing that I would just say as well is actually, COVID made us do some things that when things were urgent and we need to get money out. And actually, one of the things that I've taken a lot of comfort from is the monies that have been distributed through BVA. We've got quite a strong audit trail of what went where, why, what it was spent on, and what came back because it wasn't always spent, or actually how it was managed. If we said, you know what, you can now spend it on something else because there's a different need, but don't give us any money back. So it's those sorts of things that we need to explore, but actually it's not an unusual process for them or us.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wooldridge. I mean, I think for me, for what I'm hearing, I still remain, how do we know that the money will get spent on the things that the borough would like it to be spent on is still the thing that I'm struggling with. But anyway, are you happy for us to move on, Councillor Wooldridge?
I think my point's been made.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your attempts to answer it, but it does remain, like Councillor Bowe is saying, and it's not on reflection on any of the, the people in BVA or any of the people we've seen tonight or anything. It's just setting a principle which, needs to be sort of, if it's once a principle is set, it's hard to get out of it, isn't it? And we just need to make sure it's squeaky clean from the start, and that there's no, and we can hold people to account, and we're being held to account, really, is what I'm saying.
If I may, I think having a pilot for 1 year also kind of gives us the chance to have lessons learned. So I think we can run it for 1 year, kind of analyze the finding, the results, and we can then always be able to refresh, upgrade, kind of as we move forward. And I think what I want to say, I think we're not basically going to say here's money, you can apply for whatever you want. There will be a criteria. I think that kind of sets clearly what the priorities are, kind of what the expected priorities are, I think, what the focus is, because we want to make sure, I think, that the grant funding will meet council priorities, because ultimately, that's where our funding should go, kind of meeting community needs and council priorities.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ganesh.
Thank you, Chair. Daniel, thanks for the report. And glad to see that you're moving away from numbers and seeing sort of the outcome-based performance, which is great to know. And it's good that, okay, fine, you're retaining the same level of funding for the organizations that previously funded. At the same time, aren't we missing out? Because in the previous paper, we've seen that there's some sort of change in trend in terms of some of the organizations' work within the borough from BVA's report. So aren't we missing out on some of the organizations that probably may overlooked by continuing the same level of funding for the organizations that were funded in current financial year? For example, I would like to see, or the trend could be, people like to spend more time outdoor with nature, or should we fund more organizations work on sort of a natural environment, or promoting a healthy living? And should we diversify our funding into smaller charities and organizations more in order to enable more organizations in ward level and small community level to function and work with the residents? So aren't we missing that opportunity by continuing the same level of funding to the same organizations for another 1 year?
So just to clarify, sorry, we are only continuing sort of the level of funding in the organization for strategic funding. So program grants will all stop at the end of March 2022, and hence, the motivation of trying a new model so we can have more diversification and more organizations applying. So that's very much the intention of the community grants, by making the grant funding more flexible. And I think, as we go through our review in 22-23, we may find that when we come out of it, strategic organizations might be different as well.
Is that okay, Councillor Ganesh?
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. It's just that my concern about, are we missing out or by continuing for 1 year? So whether we should we do that for April, or should we wait for a rollout for another year and then continue for 2023-24? So the question is around the timing.
So, sorry, Councillor Banter, you wanted to come in.
I'm just going to turn around and say, to be honest, I think we just need to go back to strategic grants or strategic organisations where we're paying core funding, because they will never be completely financially sustainable without some money from us. And actually, that's quite a long process to work out how do their finances work, what are we paying for, does it need to be slightly different? Because are they doing enough diversification and fundraising or revenue generation, etc., etc.? But I just want to reiterate the point that Daniel made, which is we're absolutely, the program funding has stopped, and we will restart a different program. And I want to add a different view to it as well, because I think it's also fair to say all we've got in front of us tonight is the list of people who were successful for program funding. If you think about the people who applied for program funding, the list in the last 2 years, the list has been much longer, and we're really focused, Jay, on ensuring that we can set up a pilot that really, because I have some frustration that some of those organisations who applied and who were unsuccessful, it was down to the quality of their bid, not their work or the outcomes that they could have achieved. So in some respects, by changing the process and working with BVA, I actually believe we get a better quality process and we achieve what you want.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. I think it clears a lot of my doubts around, because I would like to see more smaller organizations funded, more diversified courses, and especially around natural environment conservation area. Right, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Councillor Ganesh. Councillor Mamalaneni.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Daniel, for your report. My concern is again on the same program grant funding and the criteria to give the program funding to various organizations. And 2.17 says that my understanding is here council doesn't have any say on this one according to the wording. And when I heard from the Daniel, it looks like council will have say on it. Where does the council fit in this program grant funding for 22-23?
So the council will definitely have a say. The idea, I think, is at the moment, basically the way we work is, the way the program grants work, we will get applications in, they would be reviewed internally. We would engage with BVA, but BVA only, I think, in terms of kind of getting their views. What we want to do, I think, for next year is actually engage a wider group of people to get views from kind of cross-sector representation, from health, from well-being, from from natural environment and so forth, so that we actually kind of get those views across the local level. But I think ultimately it is council funding, and although the recommendations will be made by a panel, I think my understanding is that the ultimate decision would be made by the portfolio holder, I think, and with recommendations from the panel and officer. So I think, we will still want to retain control, basically, of how the funding is spent, but we want to make sure that it's a more collective decision, so that we actually get the views, from different sort of cross-sector views, but also that will help us identify, I think, because a project sometimes might come in, through the community grant, but it might be better funded through CCG funding, and therefore, CG might be able to fund that project, and our grant board can actually go further and fund another project. So it's very much about sort of, I would say, to some extent, making our funding go further by pulling together the knowledge and the intelligence and the various organizations that do grant funding locally.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying it, Daniel. Yes, if that would be made clear on the program grant funding section on the page 17, that would be very helpful.
Apologies, my phone was going off, so I had to mute. Just when I thought husbands had their uses, which was to answer phones, they don't answer them. If you don't mind, Councillor Mullany, if I could just follow up with a couple of little questions of my own that are on the same subject. So, who will hold I think it's 1.2 million community grants? Is that money that the council will hold, or will it be the BVA that's holding it and handing it out? And how are we anticipating how much the BVA will want in terms of extra core funding, if you like, to administer this if it's going through the BVA?
Sorry. So on your first question, so the strategic funding will be held by the council.
Yeah.
The intention is that because we expect BVA to manage, the community grant scheme, is that we will transfer that part of the funding to BVA for them, basically, to pay the organizations, but and be managing the monitoring, and then in return we'll have kind of monitoring reports from BVA. With regards to kind of sort of how we're going to support BVA with that process, I think that will depend very much on kind of how complex the scheme is going to be or not, and I think how much time might be required by BVA to do this. So I think we haven't got a figure yet, but I think it's something that we need to consider as we have these conversations with BVA on developing that scheme.
Yeah, thank you. So my comment to that would be, if we've already taken 10% out, was that 135,000 we're taking out, which does worry me. We will probably be taking more out if there's an administrative cost, if the BVA don't administer this as part of their core funding. I found Carol and Daniel's reaction to sustainability and core funding and what that means, I thought was quite interesting. So the concern to me is that there might be quite a diminution, a reduction in the money that actually goes to charities in doing this process. And that concerns me greatly, which that's a view. I'm not asking it as a question. I'm giving it as a view. Thank you, Daniel. So are we happy to move on? I think Councillor Mullany, was that all right? Coming back to you.
Yes, that's fine. I just asked for 2.17 to make it explicit that council will have say on it.
Yes, yeah, that's
great. That is recorded, and that would be fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Councillor Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair. I've just been through two separate experiences which are very pertinent to this. Just before this meeting, I was filling in my ward councillor grant paperwork and filling in the different bits of paper and putting them all together in an email. And it occurred to me, I've just raised about £20,000 for local community stuff around here. through, I don't know if you've heard of the Greenham Trust and the Good Exchange. And the Good Exchange is basically a portal that that they use to help organisations raise money and match funders with organisations. And it occurred to me that it's only a minor thing, but it was an awful lot easier filling it in through the portal than it is collecting all the different bits of paper to put together and email off to some unknown person. And I'm quite experienced in it. And we were talking earlier about how some people are better at writing bids than others. And I'm just wondering whether or not we should be thinking about doing this through a portal of some description. And the other thing that was very useful through the Greenham Trust is they tend to give match funding as well. And I found locally it was an awful lot easier to say, look, if you give me £1,000, I've got £1,000 in the bank that this organisation will give me as well. So I'm wondering whether or not that's something we can factor into our grant making going forward.
If I may, absolutely, Councillor Mahaffy. I think, the match funding element is really important for us because I think, every grant scheme you apply for, I think, always require them, whether it's 10, 20%, 50%. And I think at the moment, we don't really have that as part of our funding. But I think, it goes back, to the point of that was made by BV earlier. I think also that sometimes reliance on the small sources of funding. And I think, what we want to do through the scheme and working with BV is kind of try to get people to apply to different pots of money. But I think then using maybe the council funding, as match funding to secure funding from another source.
Okay, Councillor Mahaffy.
Exactly, and the portal I just found made life a lot easier because it breaks it down into very simple chunks rather than being presented with this great sort of mass of, oh my goodness, I've got to raise all this money.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly like the idea of having multiple sources of funding all sitting around a table and thinking about how we work together to be able to fund something. That sounds much more collaborative and useful than having a pot of, a project piece of money coming from us and a project from other people. That does sound a more efficient and effective way of bringing money together. Daniel, did you want to say? Oh, Simon, sorry, Councillor Bound.
I just wanted to, and it was really a bit of a previous point, because I also just wanted to do a bit of comparison for us all, because I think there's a reality, isn't it, that says actually the overall size of the pot is in the consultation for the budget. And that's why the decision is going to Cabinet after that consultation, after the decision at full council. I also wanted, I was recently doing some work for a local authority up in the Midlands. And because I'm particularly interested in this piece of work, I was really focused on how much money they had. And actually, as a comparator, I just want to share something with you. Their overall programme pot was £40,000. The total amount of money they gave CAB was £50,000, and that was it. And I think there's a reality about that, isn't it, that says we are incredibly fortunate in Basingstoke and Deane that we have what we have in assets that generate the revenue that allow us to make this sort of discretionary spend and support lots of services that many other funders haven't funded for some time. And I think there's a reality about that says, we also need information about the settlement that we can get from central government, et cetera, and all sorts of things that may have an impact on our finances and interest rates, et cetera. But actually, I think there's also something when we talk about reductions, it shocks me personally, and I feel terribly fortunate as a councillor in Basingstoke and Deane that our 10% reduction is actually significantly larger than some councils of the same size overall budget.
Yeah, yes, that's worth noting. Definitely. Yes, Daniel.
Just to say, I think we're doing a piece of research at the moment, to actually look at all the various the way grants are distributed and managed, across Hampshire authorities, to get that information to help us look at, what the new community grant scheme would look like. But as Councillor Bound said, just have the information we've gathered. I think so far Basingstoke and Deane is the borough council or this council with the highest level of grant funding in terms of budgets. Everybody else basically is significantly lower than our district.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Mahaffy. Yes, you're fine, aren't you? I asked you before. Sorry, not going back. Councillor Compton-Burnett.
Thank you. I'm delighted to hear that we provide so much funding in relation to other boroughs for the voluntary sector. And I think it's a great idea to review how it's spent and how it's allocated. But I am very concerned that we're just removing £200,000 grant funding for that sector, just like that. And we criticise charities for not planning. They will have planned expecting that that money will be there in this year ahead, not relying on it, not saying we'll obviously get it, but the fact is that that pot has been there. And I think just turning it off and just focusing on the 15 charities that get strategic funding is very unfair on the many, many more small charities. And the other point I'd like to make is that I think that the CEP should have the opportunity to comment on the detail of the pilot, because I think that together we have some very useful experience, and I think it would be helpful to see the community strategy and the detail, so that we can provide as much helpful input as we can to make this work really well.
Okay, thank you.
If I just may respond to Councillor Compton-Burnett's comments, is actually that's not true. The money that's being reduced is in the programme pot. The programmes are set for a specific amount of time and actually have always been due for the money to finish. If organisations have been relying on the funding without even having an application in, I think that's something that would concern me greatly.
So the strategic funding is staying, the ones that rely on it as core funding.
I understand that, but if we look back over this COVID time, and we've all been talking about how brilliantly the charities have used the 200,000 to provide all sorts of services that we've really valued. And now just removing it suggests that actually it's not necessary, but how are they going to provide the same sorts of projects again? I know that you're saying that they can't rely on it all the time, but the fact is that that's been used to very good effect, and just removing it will take a huge number of very special, very useful services from the borough.
My point was they're different services. And I get your point about the overall pot, but actually the services that were paid for this year and last year may well have been different from the services that were paid the years before that. And actually that's the whole point about programme funding. And that's why in some respects I look at that and go, we've got, I don't know, a dozen organisations out of 675. And actually there is a reality about that actually what we need to do, because our income is reducing and also our responsibility is frontline services that we're responsible for, actually is look at how we make sure we work collaboratively with other public services, because there is also some money available that perhaps isn't spent as effectively as it could be, that our money can make sure in the match funding way gets more money from lots of other public services, so the third sector gets more money in a more helpful way that's more sustainable, rather than, because in some respects one of the issues that we have with programme funding is exactly your point, Abigail, which is I'm not sure it's terribly helpful having short-term programme funding, because that doesn't allow organisations to plan at all.
I hear what you say, but I think I'm still very concerned that it's just being taken away straight away. I think that I agree that we should definitely review it all, and that's a fantastic idea. But I think this year we should keep that 200,000 in while we're having the review, and then when we've done the review, everybody's on the same page. Everybody knew it was coming, and we can all work at it together.
So can I just ask where you got the 200,000 from, Councillor Compton-Burnett? I've not got that.
It's in 6.1, the grants. 21-22 is, oh sorry, 200,000, apologies. For 21-22, the programme grant is 0.2, and in the budget it's proposed to be 0.
Okay, I think that's a bit of confusion about. Daniel, would you be able to just take us through the table that's at top of page 21 in our pack, because I think there's a slight confusion about how it's being interpreted.
Yes, so just to clarify, the programme grants will no longer be there in 20 to 23. They'll be replaced by community grants. So there is no money for program grants in 2023, but there's 0.9 for community grants. So the reduction is 110,000, not 200.
Okay, but it's still very significant.
Yes, yes. I just want to be careful that we're not getting confused about the figures, Councillor Contabinette. But yeah, yes, it is significant. I'm not saying it's not significant. But okay, I think I had Councillor Tustain, although she seems to have disappeared off my screen.
No.
Thank you, Chair. I was just about to point out that the confusion about.
Oh, all right. Okay. Okay, that's fine. I just lost you for a moment there. So I think we've had lots and lots and lots of different views and questions. The only thing that I would say is that we had, I think, 3 councillors, probably 4 if you count myself, all mention about slight anxiety, or concern might be the wrong anxiety, about what the pilot might look like, and therefore I'm conscious of the fact that it's going to be quite hard to see that paper before it goes to Cabinet. The reality is that it's due for Cabinet, I think, on the 8th of March, if I've remembered the date correctly, and CEP meets later, a week or 2 after that. So in the normal structure that we've got at the moment, we wouldn't be seeing it again. We would not be seeing any details about the pilot or this paper. We don't meet in February at the moment, we meet in January. So I think it's important that, I'll come to you in just a sec, Simon, that if we wanted to see the paper, the implication would be that we would need to have another meeting structured in, or if people have felt that what they've heard today has given them sufficient confidence that they feel that actually it's okay, they don't feel the need to see the paper, that's fine. I'm just putting out there that we're not likely to. Simon, what did you want to add?
What I want to add is actually timing is really, really important, because actually what we want to do is start constructing it and actually talking to the sector as well, and sort of helping us to make sure all the right elements are in it. It doesn't answer your question, Chair, but I wonder whether there's an opportunity for me to bring the paper after it's happened to talk you through why it's got in it, what it's got in it, and why, and how we're going to evaluate the pilot.
Okay, so I think if I could take this in sort of 2 chunks, we've got two ways of doing this. I think one is that we would have to try and see if we could meet as a committee between the various meetings that the paper has to go through before it goes to Cabinet. And I don't know until Ellie actually looks at it whether that is possible, but we could ask. Or we can have the paper afterwards and have a look at it and see what we think. Councillor Wooldridge, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we are going to come back, and would it be a good idea to come back with somebody from BVA as well, so that we can ask questions of them as well? Because some of them, given that they're going to be delivering this, it'd be quite nice to, you know, if we got specific detailed questions to see how they respond to that, so that we, you know, because they're the ones ultimately going to be accountable for this.
Okay, so can I just ask a question with a show of hands? Do members think that CEP should see the paper in draft, which would be before it went to Cabinet? If you don't think we should, keep your hand down. If you think it should, put your hand up. I have Councillor, I think the only person who thinks not is Councillor Poland. So I think everybody else thinks it would be a good idea. Okay, so yeah, yes, Daniel.
Just, I think, you know, we need to consider the sequencing of the reports.
Indeed.
Because before I take the report to CEP, I want Cabinet briefing to have the chance to look at it. And looking at the dates, and because of the lead time for submission of reports, it's going to be very difficult to have a meeting in February. And I think, you know, we could push the decision, you know, to later, but I'm very keen to have the grant schemes, you know, ready to launch, I think, in April. So it's just, you know, just for consideration. It's because I think, you know, the lead times, the sequencing doesn't always kind of work beautifully between Cabinet and committee, unfortunately.
Yeah, I get that. So what I think, if the committee is happy to leave it with the chair and vice chair, Councillor McKay, we will talk with colleagues to see whether it is possible for CEP to have an opportunity to comment on the draft in February. And if it's not, then we would take it afterwards. Councillor Compton-Burnett.
Yes, please could we have the community strategy at that point as well, because it will be really important to see both together.
I'm not sure where, I mean, that there is a school of thought that says that strategy might be ready in March, but I'm not sure that we can guarantee it, but we can request that, Councillor Compton-Burnett.
Right. If I may, Councillor, just to say, I believe, I think, my colleague might have, correct me, I believe the intention is to take the community strategy to CEP for review in March.
Yes, that was my understanding, but I haven't had that confirmed, which would, if we saw the paper after it had been agreed by Cabinet, Councillor Compton-Burnett, then we would see it at the same time as the community delivery strategy, but that is after the fact. So I think we can say with confidence that we will definitely see it at least in March. That is the pilot, details around the pilot, one-year pilot of community grants. But what we will do is go away and see if it is at all possible to weave in an opportunity for CEP to comment on it first, because I think there is anxiety around the table about what it will look like. But we'll see what we can do. Are people content with that? Yes, hopefully. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much indeed. So before we move on, I'm mindful that it's 20 to 9. We are in danger of running a little bit late, depending on how the next papers go. Would people like to have a literally 5-minute comfort break, or do people want to push on? A comfort break, wave hand. There's one person. Yeah, okay. So if we could we will come back to start at 10 to 9. So that's 7 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Jenny?
Yeah.
I know we're out of session. I just put a comment on the chat. I don't know if it's possible, but I was suggesting on that last paper, can it be circulated by email for us to comment on rather than having to go to full committee? Or does it have to go to full committee?
Well, that I've noted that comment, Simon, and we'll see what we can do.
Super,
I don't know what the protocols are.
No, me neither. Thank you.
Chair.
Hi. Yeah.
We're not live at the minute, are we?
Yes, we are.
Okay, I'll wait then in that case.
Okay, so 10:02. I'm hoping that other folks will tune in quickly. Councillor Waldridge, Councillor, that's great. Councillor Disdain. Super. So our next agenda item, if we could reconvene, is the review of grass cutting 2021. This is the same paper. I asked specifically that the same paper came to CEP as went to scrutiny, because I did not want to have officers having additional work and repetition. And I hope everybody who wasn't already at scrutiny has been able to watch this section of the meeting, so we don't repeat what was talked about there. We're being asked to consider the report and the information it contains, but I would also ask that we particularly focus on the lessons learned section, paras 2.33 to 2.38, and exploration around the policy for grass cutting and the wider estates maintenance function going forward. If we could focus on that, that would be absolutely fantastic. So we have a public speaker, Mr. Paul Beavers, but before we invite him to speak, I would like to ask Councillor Eachus and Rob Draper if they would like to introduce the topic.
Hi, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to give a very brief introduction about what the paper was about and say it obviously been to scrutiny. So I don't think there's a great deal more for me to add to what you have said until we start questions and the debate. Yeah, I mean, Rob will give a presentation and go through the paper, and then we'll wait to see what questions come up from that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Rob?
Good afternoon, councillors. I'm just struggling with my view here. There we go, that's got it. So I'm not obviously going to propose to go through the report line by line. As Hayley said, it's already been through through scrutiny. I suppose the key issues here were obviously the planned shift from previously an 11 cuts per season down to 8, which is the standard for most local authorities. I think it would be fair to say that perhaps last year was a fairly exceptional year for us in a whole number of areas. One is that we due to the COVID issues, we ended up feeling fairly short-staffed over the winter maintenance period, which resulted in us overrunning slightly with winter maintenance. That put us slightly on the back foot. We then ended up with, as I think you can see fairly clearly in the key graph on section 2.15, the busiest growing season for I think it's about 100 years or something, with this large spike of growth shown in the orange in May, June, and that was due solely to the wet and mild conditions that we had at the time. You might want to contrast that with the previous year, which at the same period saw a very, very dry period, had a distinct reduction in growth. However, that wasn't what we experienced. What we experienced was an exceptionally rapid period of growth. That was true of all areas across the UK. That coincided with our first main cut of the year. That cut is always the slowest cut because the grass is longer and tougher since it's been growing slowly over the winter period. And there is no doubt that that peak of growth slowed us down immeasurably. That was compounded by issues with staffing again through the COVID restrictions at the time. And at that time, because the grass was growing for everybody else across the UK, there was a national shortage of staff and equipment to bring in to tackle that. Now, having said that, bringing in staff from outside and equipment from outside is problematic because we have a very, very mixed estate. We cut grass for HCC, we cut grass that is our own, and we cut grass for assorted housing associations across the borough. And that gives a very complex matrix of grass. On top of that, we also have areas which are designated for biodiversity purposes, so we don't cut them in the same way that we would cut normal amenity grass. And obviously it takes an awful lot of local knowledge to know which patch of grass you're cutting, which patch of grass you're not cutting. So we ended up not using any external staff. What we did instead was we looked at our own resources. And as a result of that, we trained up some of our normal street cleansing staff to use the mowers. Obviously, they're very familiar with the land already, so that local knowledge is retained. We also made better use of some of our other staff within the service. And that overall had a very positive effect in that it broadened our staffing pool. And we now carry that larger staffing pool into this year. Obviously, we are now in the winter period, so we're now focusing on cutting back the vegetation, trimming back, and dealing with all those issues that we would normally do in the winter period. But as you say, focusing on the what we're going to be looking at moving forward is lessons learned, section 2.33 onward. So the fact that we are now better placed with more staff who are available to drive the mowers. We established some better working practices, and we're undoubtedly in a more flexible and better resource situation than we were. So whilst it wasn't a good year, I am fairly comfortable that we are happy with the situation we're in and where we will be moving forward in 22-23 should I say. I'll take questions now.
Okay, thank you, Robert. And I just want to check if Mr. Beavers is available to speak. Oh, yes. Good evening, Mr. Beavers.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over to Councillor McKay, who I think is going to do timekeeping for us.
Yes, just a few words from me. Yes, welcome, Mr. Beavers, to the CEP committee this evening. I know that you've spoken to committees before, so you know the ground rules very well. You have 2 minutes to address the committee when you're ready, and I'll give you a gentle warning about 20 seconds from the end. Thank you.
Stated Cabinet priorities are to improve biodiversity and strengthen communities with high quality standards. That is not the lived experience of community conservation groups. The report does not mention conservation groups in the context of biodiversity and grass cutting, only BIS. That speaks volumes about the relationship of the authority with its own residents and their efforts for biodiversity over 2 decades. This report makes no mention of the restrictions, inadequate services and service levels that groups have endured for 5 or more years. We would like councillors to encourage communities to take greater responsibility for some green spaces and the services they need. BIS is a top-down model where communities receive only the services council is inclined to deliver and retains sole control. We need greater biodiversity and more skills, including locally, to achieve it. We also need access to a wider range of services and accountability for the services delivered. Refer para 2.35. Yes, there is a risk of errors from allowing contractors, but operations are essentially contractors too. They have resource restrictions, a high staff turnover, send people to areas they do not know without the skills they need, and not infrequently the equipment. They make mistakes too. Operations may say they carefully manage BIS areas for biodiversity. We're not so convinced. In any event, long-established groups have received less care. How can biodiversity be a priority for a council with a single essential item of equipment, one trained operator,
20 seconds,
so no backup, and that person leaves at the most critical time of the year? The group I lead in Hatch Warren has waited since August for scheduled cut and collect. We are in December and 5 sites to be cut by mid-September remain uncut. We only need 1 or at the most 2 cuts in a year, not 8. Finally, councillors, biodiversity is not amenity management. The role of communities and management of green spaces needs to be reassessed. Communities should be customers and encouraged to take some of the responsibility as well as funding for managing their green spaces. Please help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beavers. I think Councillor Eachus wishes to speak. You've just remuted yourself, Councillor Eachus. That's fine. You've gone back again.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, and thank you to Paul. Obviously, always appreciate him coming along, and I know how hard he works and how passionate he feels about these things. But it's just to sort of give some reassurance. This paper doesn't deal with biodiversity. It doesn't deal with any of the things that Paul just mentioned, simply because that's not what this paper is about. It isn't because we as a council don't care about those things. This was simply to do with the overrun of the winter maintenance programme and the standard grass cutting, the BIS, all of that, those things that are extremely important to this council, all the volunteers, that Paul being one of them, and all the people he works with, you know, on places like Old Down, they're separate to this. My colleague Mark Fell in the cabinet deals with that, and it's just to reassure you, Paul, that that's not what the purpose of this paper was. And if you look at the briefing note for scrutiny, so those things are all being worked on, and those things are all separate. That's why it's not in the paper.
But it mentions BIS, for example, in there. It mentions biodiversity in connection with.
But briefly, but the purpose of the paper wasn't that. The purpose of the paper was the scrutiny, and it's just to provide that reassurance that the paper is a very brief paper just to deal with the run over of the winter maintenance programme. And, you know, all the other things that you've raised are much more detailed papers. And as I say, that comes under biodiversity, which Councillor Rafal deals with, and has got a lot of work going on in that regard.
Well, fair enough, but I would ask committee to think in future whether or not biodiversity, if council is going to report on grass cutting, then that's an important element of what we expect, and we've not been getting. So I ask committee to make their own judgment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beavers. I appreciate your contribution very much. And I think around the table, a lot of us would support more opportunities to promote biodiversity in our various wards, but as Councillor Eachus has said, this is not the main thrust of this particular paper, but we have noted with thanks your comments. So if we could move to comments from committee. So Councillor Ganesh, I have you up first.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks, Robert, for the paper. And thanks, Councillor Eachus, to be here and clarify things that are coming out of the paper. There's a couple of points in the paper mentioned about the schedule and where there are areas that were left out purely because of the biodiversity. And the Robert clearly mentioned that there is some sort of work need to be done with local groups in order to get the local knowledge for the areas where those can be left to grow for longer, then it should be cut. So this goes back to Paul Beaver's comment about the local groups' involvements and engagement with the Borough Council teams who work on this grass cutting. So can we assure that that link is there? So can we assure that sort of an engagement happens to make sure that the local knowledge is translated to the councils, the ground maintenance team, which I think, in my opinion, is need a bit more work. And I understand from Councillor H's comment about that's the area that Councillor Raphael is working on in terms of biodiversity work. But this particular work around the areas, those are left to grow longer. And going back to Robert's point about the local group's knowledge is important. Are we doing enough work to make sure that those local groups are engaged and those knowledge are translated to councils, grass cutting and ground maintenance groups? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, I think I can give you some positive news there. There is good engagement between the community groups and our operations. We have further entrenched that within the structure this year by moving the community engagement team from the Connected Communities team into the operations team. So that link is now embedded within the operations team itself. And we have staff appointed within those roles. And as has been pointed out, we did lose a member of staff earlier in the year. Unfortunately, staff turnover is a fact of life, but we've just refilled that post. And that team is specifically there to coordinate the work of volunteers with the work of the operations team.
So could I just clarify, Robert, the member of staff you're talking about, is that the biodiversity officer or a different post?
No, it was, sorry, pardon me. It was one of our staff who was tasked very much with organising and to link in with the volunteers. Okay. And was engaged with frontline operations work.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ganesh, you wish to come back?
If it's okay to come back. Robert, my question is specifically around the areas left to grow longer. And you mentioned that local knowledge is important for the areas where you identify can be left for longer. So that eventually help both the council's workload as well as the nature. So I would like to see that work is carried out to make sure that the local knowledge is translated and that reflect on your schedule of work for next season. So I would like to know a bit more about the work, because I understand the link that council work with Natural Basingstoke or any other local groups. But in this specific area, I would like to see the evidence of work being carried out to make sure that local knowledge is translated to your local, the seasonal groundwork or the grass cutting schedule.
Okay, perhaps I should have clarified a little about the concept of local knowledge in the context of the operatives who are driving the equipment and how well they know the area, so that when they arrive at a particular part of the town, they know which areas of grass are to be left and which areas are to be cut. However, your point is equally valid for the local knowledge of which areas are suitable to be left. And we do that by working closely with the local conservation groups and the local community groups, and also with our natural environment team, who also have a lot of expertise and knowledge in this area. So those areas of grass where we have this, say, the cut and collect type approach and the reduced cutting frequency are all agreed well in advance between those groups, so that there is a very clear idea of what we're going to do, what we're looking to achieve, That is, the biodiversity of those areas are then carefully monitored as part of the process to ensure that we are achieving our aims. So it is a structured and organised and agreed process.
I think Tom, thanks. I think Tom wanted to add a comment. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So yeah, obviously Rob's covered it largely there. I mean, just to reassure Councillor Ganesh and others that right at the beginning of the Hatchwarren and Beggarwood BIS, you know, we sat down with the chair of Natural Basingstoke and Paul and very much looked at maps, got them all out on a big table with Councillor Raphael, talking about which areas particularly we wanted to focus on, you know, very much working hand in hand with the, you know, those conservation groups to determine which areas we would focus on. You know, it isn't as straight as Robert said before. You know, it is more complex because actually a lot of the areas that we've included as part of the BIS are Hampshire County Council's highway verge. And obviously we've worked with Hampshire to make sure that they are happy with the approach we are taking. Clearly they've got a priority around highway safety, etc. So they needed to be completely satisfied with the approach that we would take in those areas. So, you know, it is a partnership approach, and we do want to work with the volunteer groups, you know, to help shape that as we move it forwards.
Thank you, Tom. Is that okay, Councillor Ganesh?
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Rob. Because I like to see this being applied all around the borough. You've done a great job with Hatchwarren BIS, but I would like to see that being rolled out and working closely with more community groups, so that can be translated. Your good work in Hatchwarren can be translated all around the borough. So continue doing what you're doing, and I would like to see and be part of it. And I'm happy to engage with any of the groups and with the ground maintenance team if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Councillor Mullany, would you like to ask a question or give a point of view?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And once again, thank you, officers, for your report. I welcome extra resources that you pointed out, what we are getting in the ground maintenance team. Madam Chair, that, you know, my point of view here is the communication bit, you know, is one area where we need, I would like to make comment on it. Like our bin collections, which is working very well, I would like to ask the portfolio holder to extend the similar kind of services and communications to the local areas. I know this is a weather dependent issue where it is not exactly possible to predict, you know, when those people will be there and, you know, when they are cutting the grass or when they are cutting the hedges on it. At least we can give a broad timetable saying that, okay, this area will be covered in this week, or at least the week schedule, like in the May 4th week, the area of Kempshot, this area postcode will be covered. And again, now the technology has gone up so much, Madam Chair. So why can't we make use of the technology and put our technology GPS tracking systems on our lawn mowers? We have around 6 or 8 lawn mowers, whatever it is. Make sure that they are, you know, we can give that visibility to the communication for the transparency, and that makes, you know, a good impact. That's what I believe. So that is my comment on the taking forward and the lessons forward on this one.
Who'd like to pick that up?
I can just say take it on board, but I think try and, you know, it's managing residents' expectations. We have a summer programme, but it is weather dependent. It's, you know, everything dependent. And I'd be very cautious in saying we're there in the first week of May and then we don't. But it's certainly something I'll take back to officers and consider. We've got a very good comms team that comms it throughout the grass cutting season anyway. So I just, yeah, and I'm not sure how it would work, but in GPS trackers on lawn mowers, again, it's managing people's expectations. It's not just having the trackers, it's then having people, you know, logging into those things. I'm just not sure how realistic that is, but certainly I'll take it back to the team and discuss it with them.
Robert, did you want to comment, or are you comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's possible to GPS track just about anything these days. I'm just not so sure that would give people a great deal of knowledge and insight, because we do move the teams around a fair degree. And also we do cut different things at different stages with different pieces of equipment, as it says in the report. So we could, for example, have a mowing gang out where they're using the large tractor-drawn cutters in an area one day, and then it might be a day or so later that we have the smaller mowers in to do the edges and the finer work. So it's difficult to, you know, we could equally say that we were cutting grass in those areas on, you know, on 3 or 4 different days before the job is actually completed. Also, you know, as our mower repairer guide will tell you, mowers take a fair bit of hammering. They work hard for their living, and having a delicate GPS tracker on it, we're not sure that's a compatible use of the equipment, really. But as Hayley said, perfectly happy to ask the questions. There may be some ruggedized versions out there.
I think from a point of view of understanding, I suppose, how long it takes to do the, which you probably know anyway, but how long it takes to do the rounds and how long it takes to go from section to section. I mean, I think from a point of view of helping residents to manage expectations. I mean, I see the operations teams, it says work closely with the comms team to advise residents about grass cutting operations. But I think there's an area around actually ward councillors can help here, because it's the ward councillors that usually get the questions from residents about that the grass is too long and when are they going to come. And I don't think they're expecting us to say they'll be here on Tuesday week, but I think what residents are looking for is a time scale that's reasonable to expect them to come in. And I think what happened this year was there was good intentions. I think, you know, people were saying, well, they should be here by the end of the month. And I can see why they were saying that now, having read your paper, because normally it would take 6 weeks, I think it says, to get round everywhere. But actually it was taking probably twice that long at some points this year. So then we as ward councillors were talking to residents and saying, you know, we should get people here in 4 weeks or something. And then of course it was too difficult because actually the grass was so long and it was so difficult to manage. So there's a bit about helping, you know, what I think members here would want to do is absolutely acknowledge the fantastic work that the grounds maintenance people do, because it's hard work and it must feel a bit relentless at times because it's going round and round and round, doing it again and again and again. But it is so valued by our residents, and huge appreciation from them and from this committee about the work that they do. So absolutely want that on record, how appreciative we are. So for us, it's about what we might be able to add value to and help the team with. And so the comms part of it is something that I think we could do better. And I think ward councillors could help the maintenance teams with, if they had sufficient information, correct information about where we could expect the grass cutting to be next. You know, just telling people, for example, in the winter maintenance programme, to be able to say to people, yes, those bushes will get cut over the winter season. Okay, that's fine. You know, people are comfortable with that. So I just wonder whether, if the teams are going round in a set routine all the time, which is the impression I get here, then it might be possible for ward councillors to get a reasonable idea about when they'll come to particular areas, not streets, areas within the borough. So if we could move on, Councillor Mullany, are you comfortable with the response there?
Yeah, I'm comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mahaffey?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a suggestion, if I may. I watched scrutiny earlier on, and a lot of the conversation seemed to revolve around the potential conflict between rewilding verges and rewilding areas, letting them grow, and the public perception that we just don't care, that we're letting them down on our duties and we're not mowing. And it seems to be that the conclusion that came out of scrutiny was that if we try to rewild an area, then we need to put up signs to say why we're rewilding it. I've seen a lot of those in West Berkshire, and I have to be honest, I'm not a fan of them. And the reasons are threefold. One, they look like an apology. Two, after a while, they tend to get pretty scruffy, and it draws attention to the fact that it's actually a scruffy bit of area, a scruffy bit of land. And three, I don't think that the energy, the materials, the time, the effort that's put into putting up a sign merits the fact that all we're actually doing is saying, sorry, we haven't mown this area. However, I do have a potential solution. We've had exactly this conversation in my local village. And what we've come to the conclusion is that if with these areas that we're going to rewild, if you have a 1 meter mown strip all around the edge, on the verge, or on the roadside, it actually then looks like a very deliberate thing rather than we've just forgotten to mow this area. It's very obvious what you're doing. And in actual fact, it looks quite smart. It looks quite pretty in some ways. And then you can start getting creative if you've got a big area that you can start mowing paths through the middle of it. So that's something I would like to see rather than big, horrible, unnecessary street furniture, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we'll take that on board, and I can refer that back to my colleague Mark Raffel, who deals with that type of thing. This paper's more about the actual grass cutting programme, but take on board what you're saying, and we'll obviously refer that back to Mark in the correct course of things for all the work that he's doing in relation to biz and biodiversity.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, Councillor, that we do undertake some of that style work in areas across the borough where we allow grass to grow. We mow pathways through it to sort of, you know, give some direction to people's wanderings, shall we say. So that is
I think it's the border strip round the edge that makes it look very deliberate and spartans up what is potentially a very scrappy area.
Yeah, happy to take that suggestion to the operations team and see what their views are on the practicality of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Poland.
Thank you, Chair. I fully endorse the comments you've made about the team. It must be a soul-destroying job, frankly, having done it and then going back again. But I think all credit to them, notwithstanding the difficulties they had. Hopefully it was a one-off year. Having said that, climate change and all the rest of it is with us. And I just wonder whether we have got in place measures, should it happen again this winter or into the spring. But the other point is, and I don't know the answer, and I may be being overly critical, but I take your point, Chair, that if the ward councillors, particularly those of us in the rural areas where there may or may not be more grass, I don't know, but if we were in advance knowledge of what was not possible because of all the conditions that you had to face, you can't cut grass when it's completely wet, I fully understand, that information could have been put out to certainly the parish councils and or then some of the residents. I just got the feeling that we were always on the back foot, and lots of residents were complaining, in some cases quite vociferously, without actually understanding the very real problems that, you know, the team had to deal with it. And that's not helping the matter at all, unfortunately. It actually makes your situation worse.
Yeah, and I think I agree. And from the lessons learned in the report, we said that we would comms it better. This year was totally different. It was, you know, we'd run over from the winter maintenance, the grass was growing, you know, the wetter season, all of that together did cause issues. But we have taken all that on board. We've discussed it with the team. We've discussed it as a cabinet. We've discussed it with comms. And I think moving forward, the comms will be better in the future. So that's definitely a lesson learned.
Thank you. Councillor Poland, are you comfortable with that? Yeah, thank you. Councillor McKay.
Yeah, I just wanted to support one suggestion and caution on the other. I like Councillor Mahaffey's suggestion of a mown section sort of highlighting an area that's been deliberately left. I think that's a nice idea. I would caution about the GPS thing. I just think perhaps the unintended consequence of that is to interfere in good employer-employee relations. It's a tricky area, and we should really be very careful before entering that. I understand the point the councillor was making about communicating with the community, but I don't think that warrants the introduction of that sort of technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Presumably folks are happy with that comment and not necessarily responding to it. Yeah, that's fine. Councillor Tisdale.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I quite like the idea of obviously seeing grass being left to grow longer, and a bit of potential rewilding is great. The only thing is actually just leaving grass to grow longer isn't actually much good to a lot of biodiversity anyway, because it's just quite a barren desert for pollinators, etc. I've had, certainly in Popley, quite a few residents coming to me who would be very interested in seeing some sort of wildflower planting schemes. Now, if we replace some of our grassed areas with something there that's much more deliberate, then we wouldn't have Councillor Mahaffey's ugly street furniture, because it'd be very apparent what it is. And I know, I think Rob, you'll probably, and Tom will know this, because you obviously then have to manage that properly. So I don't know about the cost, but it would be something that I think would be really nice to look at in some of our estates, particularly where we need the regeneration of the old shrubs and things, which I know was discussed at scrutiny, so I won't go into that now. But and that would be really welcome. So we could have patches of that. That means you'd only need the one cut a year, I think they need, don't they? Those sort of wildflower meadow grasses, something like that, maybe two, which then obviously means there's less cutting. So you'd have a very obvious mutual beneficial area for everyone's well-being, and a much more aesthetically pleasing than basically a lot of long grass where you potentially get pernicious weeds and uglies starting to come in. Just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you and Gordon Wade, our landscape gardener, would view that very positively. I think Gordon's response, in fact, I know Gordon's response would be that that's exactly what we're trying to do. So the areas where we have this sort of cut and collect type system at the moment, that encourages the native species of flower and plant to come through, whereby more frequent cutting has discouraged those. The issue you have is that if you just cut and leave the grass, then that creates an artificially high nutrient level within the soil. Whereas actually a lot of these flowers and I think the plants that you would prefer to see more of, Councillor, thrive in less nutrient-rich environments. So the aim is that by cutting it less frequently and then removing the cuttings, that will stimulate the growth of those types of wildflowers that are best suited to that area, i.e. the ones that are dormant already within the soil. And that if you do that, there isn't actually a need to re-sow and plant what might be otherwise, you hate to use the word alien, but species that are less suited to that environment. It's all about giving nature a chance to recover, if you like. And one of the reasons we do this with the biodiversity cuts, as we call them, is because we carefully monitor the level of biodiversity. And we know that where we undertake that activity, the number of native species very rapidly recovers. So yes, it's probably not quite as glorious as those pictures you see from in the gardening magazines of, yes, we sprinkled 2,000 bee bombs across this area and suddenly everything looks lovely. But the reality is that it will look better than, like you say, some rather scrubby grassland. But it does take a little bit more time.
Okay, Councillor Tisdale. I think my question is that I get the impression from your paper that it's the interface between the winter programme and the start of the grass cutting season that the real pressure point is. And, you know, this year it was this, I think you used the word vortex, but it's sort of like the Bermuda Triangle, wasn't it, with COVID, people needing to isolate, staff being redeployed in various places. So, you know, trying to get that interface working between the winter programme and the summer programme is so important. Do you feel that there is sufficient priority given within the borough to ensure that the staff to finish that winter and stuff and get the grass cutting underway, that you get the priority at that time. I mean, I appreciate the COVID brought in a new dimension because that kind of trumped everything. Pandemics tend to do that, but in a normal scheme of things, would you say that the staff to do this work are prioritized, and that you do get the access to staff that you know, here I see very important to the, you know, redeployed staff into the grass cutting scheme from street cleansing, for example, I think really helped out. It's a really good idea. But do you feel that you get the priority that you feel you need to have at that time of year?
I think it would be safe to say that the staff that are doing the grass cutting are the same staff who do the winter maintenance. So, you know, there's a natural transition from one to the other. The issue we had this year was that we effectively had because of the restrictions of the pandemic, we weren't able to effectively deploy staff throughout the winter period. And that meant that we had more work hanging over at the end of the winter period and into the summer period when the grass cutting started. So yeah, I don't think we did anything particularly wrong. We just didn't have enough of the resource in at the right time. And that was largely because of the pandemic. Obviously, we've looked at that resourcing now. And we will be much more alert to the fact that we may have an earlier start to the grass cutting period than perhaps we might have done. And that's certainly, as I've mentioned in the report, a trend that we have. The grass cutting season is getting longer as the winters get shorter and more mild. So, you know, we just have to adapt to that in our schemes of working.
Yeah. I'm also mindful that it's 9:30. Sorry, committee. Do I have your agreement to suspend standing orders and hopefully finish this meeting at 10 o'clock? Are people in agreement with that? I'm seeing a few nods. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, Robert, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's fine. You know, I'm used to people telling me that I'm boring.
Sorry. So yeah, that would just be my reflection, that I think it's important that the resources are there at that time, because it just seems that it's a really important thing. Once you get behind in that, it's very hard to is that first cut is that important cut, isn't it? And once you've got through that, the rest follows on. So it's just being able to prioritize that. And I think the points that you put in lessons learned are very encouraging, and I think it reflects the amount of thought and work that have gone into learning from this year. So I wish you the very best of luck for the future years. I think just summing up a little bit from what committee has said, I think the overlap with biodiversity, I know this paper is not about biodiversity, but I think councillors have recognised that actually where there are BIS zones and where the community may be interested in doing more, I think it does impact on the grass cutting. So I think there is an interface with the biodiversity planning that we're doing at the moment elsewhere. I think what committee members are saying is it would be really fruitful if we engaged our local communities when we're talking about where we might have biodiversity zones and where we might want to have wildflowers and those kinds of things. So not just with maps of soil types, but also talking to our community groups about them, I think would be very valuable. But that's elsewhere. I appreciate that's not here. I'm just reflecting what people have been talking about. So unless anybody else has got anything to say, I think we could thank very much our officers for attending for this agenda item, and we can move on. Is that okay? Lovely. Okay, thank you very much indeed. So thank you, Robert and Councillor Aegis. So we move to the ice rink item, and I think we have Jonathan Banham, the development manager, here to join us for this paper. I don't know, Ian, whether you wanted to say anything as well or not on this one.
No, not particularly, Chair. I will hand this over to Jonathan for the brief update that he has.
Okay, so before Jonathan gets going, I would just like to remind CEP members that we had a comprehensive briefing on the background to this issue on the 9th of September, and a very useful visit to the ice rink itself on the 20th of September. So this paper has come to this committee because CEP requested that when the survey that the borough had commissioned had been completed and next steps had been agreed, that a paper would come to CEP. So this is the paper as a result of that. And we're really only being asked to note it. So I will ask Jonathan if he would like to just walk us through what's there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Vox. So yeah, as Councillor Vox says, it is a brief update. The council has now served the notice of repair on our tenant Standard Securities, and we are awaiting a response from them to that repair notice. It's worth also noting that some councillors may be aware that Standard Securities have been looking to sell their long lease hold interest, and that is ongoing in the background. We haven't had any approaches as yet for a formal request to assign their interest. Really, we are, as I say, we're waiting a response from Standard Securities, and the next steps and timing in this are all in their gift. Clearly, if we don't get a response within a reasonable time frame, we will ramp this up. But the outcome really will depend on the response we receive from Standard Securities in due course.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone have any comments that they want to make, or are we comfortable with that paper? Okay, Councillor Waldridge.
Can I just ask what you would say is a reasonable time scale for responding and selling, because it is just going on and on, isn't it? And I just you know, just mindful of the fact that we're going months now without really getting that further forward, really. So
we have appointed surveyors to act on our behalf. They are advising, and a combination of them and legal advice is that we have to give them a reasonable period of time. So I would suggest that if we haven't had a response by mid-January, bearing in mind it's Christmas, that would be a reasonable period within which we could expect a response, and we will follow it up.
have we given them a deadline?
You're not allowed to.
Okay.
We're in a legal process here, so there are legal steps that we have to sort of follow through, and like I say, we have to give a reasonable period of time for them to respond. Given that the report runs to a significant number of items, there is a lot for them to get their head round.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Waldridge. Councillor Mahaffey.
Chair. Clearly, the sale of the lease is a commercial negotiation, and I'm not suggesting that we should get involved with it. But the potential purchaser will have an awful lot of questions, which will probably involve us. So I'm wondering, is there merit in trying to speed it up just by approaching Standard Securities and letting them know that we would be available at any time to answer questions or to be present at whatever point in the negotiations they think is appropriate for their potential purchasers?
So with a purchaser of this type, it is not unusual for Standard Securities to go through a process where they will agree a deal with a potential purchaser before approaching the freeholder. They will not want a direct discussion. They will want to control discussions as much as they possibly can between the potential purchaser and the freeholder.
Okay.
Can I add
Take your
something
point.
to that?
Yeah, yes, certainly. Hello, Councillor Isaac.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Councillor Hawkes. Yes, if there is a purchaser of the long leasehold interest, then in due course, that purchaser would need to come to the council for its approval to the assignment, and we couldn't unreasonably withhold our consent. But clearly, one of the grounds that we might use would be to say, well, actually, the premises are not in a good state of repair, and that's a problem to us in accepting the assignment of the lease to the new party. But we're not in that position at the moment.
Are you comfortable with that, Councillor Mahaffey?
Yeah, I mean, I take both points. It's just, you know, we're all getting frustrated with it, and I'm wondering whether or not we can facilitate the speeding up of the process by offering our services at the relevant point. But I'll leave that as is. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't. I don't think we'd have any interest in delaying if there was a potential assignee for the lease.
No, clearly not. No, clearly not.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Mahaffey. Councillor McKay?
Yes, given the uncertainties on timescale for the ice rink, I'm just wondering how that might impact the plans for the leisure park in a wider sense. It'd be quite concerning to think that the ice rink, which is already, I think Councillor Wood is quite correct, has been taking a long time and it's causing concern in the community. And I'd start to get concerned that the good planning for the leisure park might be impacted adversely by the fact that the ice rink apparently goes on unresolved.
Shall I answer that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want to answer it? Or would you like me to? So,
thank you, Councillor.
As you know, following the dissolution of the agreement with New River, we're starting afresh with the leisure park, and so we're making good progress in appointing master planners, highways consultants, specialists in relation to the aquadrome, valuation, viability advisors, and so I don't see the situation in relation to the ice rink as a particular stumbling block for us to be able to get on with the work that now needs to be done at pace in relation to a new plan for the leisure park.
Okay, is that okay, Councillor McKay?
Yeah, I think that's what I hope to see. My worst nightmare, I don't know if anyone's familiar with nail houses, something that happened in China where large areas of cities were redeveloped and one or two properties couldn't be moved. Not ice rinks, but individual properties, and you've got this old dilapidated thing sat in the middle of a wider development. But
actually, Councillor McKay, you do make a good point, because what you've got to understand with the leisure park at Basingstoke is that there's quite a few of the assets are not directly owned by the council. So we're not in a position just to say, right, well, we want to move you from X to Y, because we've got situations like we've got it with the ice rink where there's a long leaseholder, and therefore it's not just a case of being able to obtain vacant possession of the site. And of course, one of the benefits potentially of the New River deal was that we would have had a war chest, if you like. I'm not sure war chest is the right word. We would have had a pot of money to enable us, if necessary, to do compulsory purchase. We'd have had, that was a £300 million scheme. But anyway, that's all in the past now. So we are going to. It is going to be a case of working around and collaborating with the existing long leaseholders.
So we're just going to say goodbye to Councillor Court, who has to leave at this point. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Court. Councillor McKay, coming back to you.
So the leisure park is on the work programme going forward.
Yes,
so I look forward to further discussion when the time comes. Thank you.
Yeah, we're due to see you in January, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. If there's no other comments or questions, I'll thank Jonathan for his paper and we'll move on. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So our next item is the Community and Environment and Partnerships Work Programme. So for the January meeting, we have papers on fly tipping, the cultural strategy, the leisure park engagement plan. So that is following the council motion. So it's literally just talking about the engagement plan. It's not the wider leisure park plan. And we also have the CCG attending as part of the Hampshire Together programme to talk about out of hospital services. So I hope the committee is comfortable with that for the January meeting. Yeah, I think everybody's fine. And then assuming that we're not meeting in February, March at the moment, the only absolutely certain item I've got is a climate change verbal update. We should possibly have a presentation from the CAB, but that is flexible. It depends on what else comes into the meeting, because we also have to be scheduled the community delivery strategy, which may well come to March, but it hasn't been confirmed to me yet. We may have the pilot for the BVA on community grants coming to that meeting after tonight's discussions. And we've also got, as you will notice, the town centre strategy with brackets spring, and I'm not quite sure what spring means. We've also got the ecological emergency action plan, which was promised us in the spring. And again, I'm not quite sure what spring means. So the March meeting has a degree of flexibility in it. Any comments that people wanted to make about the forward agenda? Councillor McKay.
Yeah, I'll be happy provided the Anvil and Haymarket features somewhere in the work programme. I'm not quite clear at the moment whether it'll come as part of the cultural strategy or the town centre. So is it in the town centre, but it's clearly a cultural landmark.
I believe from a meeting that we had earlier this week, Councillor McKay, that Ellie is going to check for us that the Anvil and Haymarket, well, the Anvil Trust really is, as we're describing it, will feature in the cultural strategy. And if it doesn't, then we hope to have an accompanying paper, or it will be scheduled in. So I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that in the next couple of weeks. Okay. Councillor Mamelaneni.
Yes, Chair, I have seen the EDA outcomes in the paper. So when can we expect that one?
Yeah, I'm not yet sure scheduled. Councillor, I'm waiting to hear the best time. I think it was in the autumn. I don't know, Ellie, do you recall when Councillor Bound thought the best time might be? I think it was when the working group finished. I think that was about September.
Yep, that was what I was going to say, September, October time.
Yes, so that's penciled in as September, October, Councillor Mamelaneni.
Okay. Can I bring one more topic? And I'm not really sure which one it fits into. There is a piece of land called Saunders Field, which was a part of the development as part of new river development. So I would like to see the council ideas or the plans for that part of the area. So when can we expect this one, or in which paper is the right place to include this?
Ian, I think you'd like to reply to that.
Thank you, Chair. Well, simply to advise that Saunders Field is part of the brief for the master planning exercise for the leisure park. So I think you'll have opportunity when some of the leisure park plans come forward some in the first iteration, some in the second iteration, I suspect, depending on the level of work undertaken at the points in time when we bring it to committee.
Is that okay, Councillor?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on the work programme? No. Thank you very much. So we'll just have a look at the, just a reminder that we've got one task and finish group, recycling in flats. And I believe, thanks to Ellie, we have an agreed membership of the group. Councillor Waldridge leading it, Councillor James, Tilbury, myself, Tostane, Jeans and Bowes. And a date's being set for the first meeting in the new year. Hopefully that meets with everybody's agreement. Yep. So if there's no other comments, we can sneak in 10 minutes before 10. I'm sorry, it's been a longer meeting than I expected, but I hope that everybody has found it a useful meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, Chair.
Good night.